Chapter 21 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 21 The Selling of Spells. The period of Stage 4 promised to be one of such a lucrative nature that the trio set to work to profit by it at once. They bribed medical men to procure for them the mumia of people suffering from every kind of disease, of criminal lunatics, of idiots and epileptics. They obtained by bribery also the blood and hair of the most abandoned men and women, rakes, thieves, murderers. They bottled and labelled, arranged and catalogued the mumia in a laboratory designed for the purpose, and when all their preparations were completed, advertised "Spells for sale. The Modern Sorcery Company Limited offer for sale every variety of spells, love charms, sleep charms, etc." In order to carry out the principal conditions of the compact, namely to do harm, they made pseudo love charms as follows. They procured the hair of a girl whom they knew to be an incorrigible and at the same time heartless flirt, and, in the manner described and related in the last chapter, made a magnes microscomy of it. When ready for use, that is, after it had been in immediate contact with the girl's flesh, so as to get it fully charged, they had portions of it set in rings, lockets and pendants. And the purchaser of any one of these trinkets had only to persuade the object of his or her affection to wear it, and his or her love would at once be reciprocated. Had the magnes microscomy been charged with real deep-rooted love, the effect on the wearer would have been highly satisfactory, but charged as it was with the effervescent and fleeting fancy of a flirt, the effect on whoever wore it could not be more disastrous. The sentiments of the hopeful purchaser would be reciprocated for a time, which would probably lead to marriage, after which the affection his adored had professed would suddenly decrease, and before the honeymoon was over, would have vanished altogether. During the week following the announcement of the sale of these spells, over 1,000 were sold, the applicants being mostly shop girls, typists, clerks and servants. In the second week the sales rose to 3,000, and every succeeding week showed a still greater increase. In charging the magnes microscomy, the motive of the purchaser had always to be taken into account. If the love charm were wanted by a woman, a housekeeper maybe, who desired some rich old man to fall in love with her in order that she might come into his property, or by a woman, a companion probably, who, having wormed herself into the confidence of some eccentric old lady, was anxious that lady should leave her all her money, Hamar took care that the magnes microscomy should be charged with a lasting infatuation, and the sale of this love spell, the spell that was sought solely that the purchaser might inherit property to which he or she had no claim, far exceeded the sale of any other spell. Indeed, it was extraordinary how many people one would never have suspected, desired spells that would do other people harm. Lady De Green, the well-known humanitarian, who was most indefatigable in getting up petitions to the Home Secretary whenever the perpetrator of any particularly heinous and inexcusable murder was about to be hanged, and who was universally acknowledged incapable of harming a fly, called surreptitiously on Hamar. "I understand," she said, "everything you do here is in strict confidence." "Certainly, madam, certainly," Hamar said. "We make it a point of honour to divulge nothing." "That being so," Lady De Green observed, "I want you to tell me of a spell that will hasten some very obnoxious person's death." "If you will give me a rough idea of their personal appearance," Hamar said, "I will make a wax image of them and undertake they will trouble you no longer." But Lady De Green shook her head. She had no desire to commit herself. "Can't you do it in any other way?" she said. "Can't you let me give them an unlucky charm, the sort of thing that might bring about a taxi disaster?" Hamar thought for a moment, and then smiled. "Yes," he said, "I think I can accommodate you." Leaving her for a few minutes, he went to the laboratory, and from a tin box marked "Homicidal Lunatic" he took a plain gold ring. With this he returned to Lady De Green, murmuring on the way the prayer he had learned from the table. "Here you are," he said, handing the ring to Lady De Green. "Give it to the person you have mentioned to me, and the result you desire will speedily come to pass." 3 days later, London was immeasurably shocked. It read in the papers that the highly accomplished Lady De Green, beloved and respected by all for the strenuous exertions on behalf of humanitarianism, had been barbarously murdered by her husband, from whom, unknown to the public, she had been living apart for years, who had suddenly, and for no apparent reason, become insane. Hamar, who was immensely tickled, alone knew the reason why. This was no isolated case. Scores of society women came to the trio with the same request. "A spell or charm or something that will bring about a fatal accident, not a lingering illness." And the person for whom the accident was desired was usually the husband, and the trio often indulged in grim jokes. Without a doubt Lady Minkhurst got her heart's desire when her husband abruptly cut his throat, but alas, amongst those decimated when the charm fell into the hands of one of the footmen was her ladyship's lover. Again, Mrs. Jacques, the beauty who at one time wrote for half the fashion papers in England, certainly secured the demise of Colonel Dick Jacques, who tumbled downstairs and broke his neck. But as in his fall the Colonel alighted on one of the maids who was not insured, and so seriously injured her that she was pronounced a hopeless cripple, Mrs. Jacques, with whom money was an object, had of course to maintain her for the rest of her life. Likewise, Sir Charles Brimpton, in jumping out of the top window of his house, besides pulverizing himself, pulverized too Lady Brimpton's pet Pekingese, Waller, without whom she declared life wasn't worth living. And Lord Snipping, in setting fire to himself, set fire to Lady Snipping's boudoir, which he had been secretly visiting, and thereby destroyed treasures which she tearfully declared were quite priceless, and could never be replaced. Crowds of young married women were anxious to get rid of their rich old relatives, who clung on to life with a tenacity that was most wearying.
"Can you give me a spell that will make my grandfather go off suddenly?"
a girl with beautiful sad eyes said plaintively to Kelson.
"Don't think me very wicked, but we are not at all well off, and she has lived such a long time, such a very long time."
"You don't want her to be ill first, I suppose?" Kelson inquired.
"Oh, no," the girl replied. "She lives with us, and we could never endure the worry and trouble of nursing her. It must be something very sudden."
"This will do it," Kelson said, giving her a locket containing the mumia or essence of life of a mad dog. "Fasten it round the old lady's neck, and you will be astonished how soon it acts."
"And what is your fee?"
the girl asked, her eyes brimming over with joyous anticipation.
"For you, nothing," Kelson said gallantly. "Only tell no one. May I kiss your hand?"
The firm's sale of spells for getting rid of husbands having risen one day to 500, and the sale of their spells for putting old people out of the way to 1,500, even Hamar, who was no believer in the perfection of human nature, was astonished. "My word," he remarked, "isn't this a revelation? Who would have thought how many people have murder in their hearts? At least half society would, I believe, become homicides if only there were no chance of their being found out and punished. Anyhow, if we go on at this rate, there will be no old people left." And it did indeed seem as if such would be the case. For the moment the idea got abroad that old people could be thrust out of existence with absolute safety and ease, there was a perfect mania amongst men, women, and even children to get rid of them, and the deaths of people over 60 recorded in the papers multiplied every day. The following is an extract from the Planet of July 28. Bolt, on July 27 at No. Elgin Avenue, S.W., Emily Jane, loved and venerated mother of Mary Bolt, M.D., in her 69th year, drowned in her bath, and all the angels wept. Cushman, on July 27, at No. Sheep Street, Northampton, Sarah Elizabeth, adored mother of Josiah Cushman, Plymouth Brother, in her 88th year, run over by a taxi. Joy in heaven. Starling, on July 27, at No. Snargate Street, Dover, Susan, highly esteemed and greatly beloved mother of Alfred Starling, Wesleyan minister, in her 71st year, lost in the harbour, asleep in Jesus. Tritickler, on July 27, at No. The Terrace, St. Ives, Cornwall, Elizabeth, adored grandmother of Tobias Tritickler, Congregationalist, in her 91st year, fell over the Malatoff. Oh, Paradise! Oh, Paradise! Brute, on July 27, at Charlton House, Queensgate, S.W., Jane, greatly beloved mother of John Brute, Labour MP, in her 83rd year, fell down the area. Peace, blessed peace. Gum, on July 27, at No. Church Road, Upper Norwood, Sophia, widow of the late Albert Gum, L.C.C., in her 85th year, choked whilst eating tripe. Sadly missed. Paveman, on July 27, at No. Queen's Road, Clifton, Bristol, Anne Rebecca, dearly beloved mother of Alfred Paveman, grocer, in her 74th year, accidentally burned to death. At rest at last. But it must not be supposed from these few notices, selected from at least 100, that the applicants for spells were by any means confined to the upper and middle classes. By far the greater number of spells were sold to the working people, to those of them who, prudent and respectable, counted amongst their aged relatives, at least, one or two who were insured. Nor was the sale of spells confined to adults, for among the numbers that flocked to consult the trio were countless county council children.
"Can you give me a spell to make teacher break her neck?"
was the most common request, though it was frequently varied with demands such as,
"I'll trouble you for a spell to pay mother out. She won't put more than 3 lumps of sugar in my tea."
or
"Mother has got very teasy lately. I want a spell to make her fall downstairs."
or
"Father only gives me 2d a week out of what I earn blacking boots. Give me a spell to make him have an accident whilst he's at work."
and it was not seldom that the trio were petitioned thus:
"Please give us a spell to make our parents die quickly. Teacher says at school perfect freedom is the birthright of all Englishmen, and we can't have perfect freedom whilst our parents are alive."
Footnote 22. Lest the reader should query this, let him consult the police in any of our big centres, and he will learn that crime and prostitution is immensely on the increase among children. In Newcastle it is estimated that there are over 2,000 girls of under 14 years of age voluntarily leading immoral lives and making big incomes. End of footnote. The statistics of those who died from the effects of accidents for the week ending August 1 of this year in London alone were: over 60 years of age, 5,000; between the ages of 25 and 60, 6,000; and for the latter deaths children alone were responsible. The greatest number of these accidents occurred in Poplar, West Ham, Battersea, and Whitechapel. And at length the working class applicants became so numerous that the Modern Sorcery Company could not cope with them, and were forced to raise their charges. Among other customers, as one might expect, were many militant suffragettes, whom Hamar and Curtis palmed off on Kelson. "Give me a spell," demanded a hatchet-faced lady, wearing a half up to the knee skirt. "One that will cause the roof of the House of Commons to fall in and smash everybody. Everybody! This is no time for half measures." Had she been pretty, it is just possible Kelson might have assented, but he had no sympathy for the ugly. They set his teeth on edge. He loathed them. "Certainly, madam, certainly," he said. "Here is a spell that will have the effect you desire. and he handed her a ring containing a Magnus microscopy fully charged with the essence of life of an idiot. "Wear it," he said, "night and day. Never be without it." She joyfully obeyed, and within 48 hours was lodged in a home for incurables. Another woman, if possible even uglier than the last, approached him with a similar request.
"Let me have a spell at once," she said, "that will make every member of the government be run over by taxis and killed. They are monsters, tyrants. I abominate them. Let them be slowly, very slowly squashed to death."
"Very well, madam," Kelson said, carefully concealing a smile. "Here is what you want. Wear it next to your heart." And he gave her a locket containing a Magnus microscopy charged with the essence of life of a leper, which he had procured at considerable risk and expense.
"I consider your fee far too high," the Suffragette said. "You take advantage of me because I'm a woman."
"Very well, madam," he said. "I will make an exception in your case, and let you have it for half the sum." With a good deal more grumbling, she paid half the fee, and fastening the locket round her neck, flounced out of the building. As Kelson gleefully anticipated, the spell acted in less than 2 days, and with such success that he was more than compensated for the monetary loss. Shortly afterwards, Kelson received a frantic visit from another Suffragette, a woman whose virulent sandy hair at once aroused his animosity. "Quick, quick!" she cried, bursting into the room where he was sitting. "Let me have a spell that will blow up every cabinet minister and their wives and families as well." "Such an ambitious request as that, madam," Kelson rejoined, "cannot be granted in a hurry. I must have time to—" "No, no! At once!" the lady cried, stamping her feet with ill suppressed rage. "To consider how it can best be done," Kelson went on calmly, "I must have time to think." The lady fumed, but Kelson remained inexorable, and directly she had gone, he made a wax image of her, and taking up a knife, chopped its head off. In the evening, he learned that a lady answering to her description had been run over by a train at Chislehurst, and decapitated. Kelson grew heartily sick of the Suffragettes. They were not only plain, but abusive, and he complained bitterly to Hamar. "Look here," he said, "it's not fair. You and Curtis see all the decent looking women, and shelve all the rest on me. I'll stand it no longer." And he spoke so determinedly that Hamar thought it politic to humour him. "Very well, Matt," he said, forcing a laugh. "I'll try and arrange differently in the future. After to day you shall have your share of the pretty ones. Anything to keep the peace. Only remember, no falling in love." End of chapter 21. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 22 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 22. The Persecution of the Martins. Hamar's one great idea on reaching stage 4 was to utilize the torments as a means of getting Gladys. Though he saw crowds of pretty girls every day, none appealed to him as she did, and the very difficulty of getting her enhanced her value and stimulated his passions. "I will give her one more chance," he said to himself, "and then if she won't have me, I'll plague her to death." He went to the Imperial, and passing himself off as her father to the new official at the stage door entrance, was shown into the ante room which led to her dressing room. It took a good deal to scare Hamar, but he admitted afterwards that he did feel a trifle apprehensive whilst he waited her advent, and his anticipations were fully realized. "Why, father," she began, as the door of her dressing room swung open and she appeared on the threshold, clad in a shimmering white dress that intensified her fair style of beauty, "what brings you?" The smile on her face suddenly died away. "You!" she cried. "How dare you? Go at once, and if you dare come here again or attempt to molest me in any way, I'll prosecute you." Hamar, dumbfounded at such an exhibition of wrath, slunk out of the room without uttering a syllable. "The vixen!" he muttered, as soon as he found himself in the street. 1,000 cats in one! Treated me like mud! Jerusalem! I'll pay her out. And I'll lose no time about it either. She'll look differently at me next time we meet." He hurried back to Cockspur Street, and going into the laboratory threw himself into a chair and thought. That same evening at 9:30, in the interval between her first and second "going on," Gladys hastened to her dressing room, and was preparing to partake of the light refreshments she had ordered when, to her horror, she perceived crawling towards her across the floor a huge cockroach. A hideous black thing with spidery legs and long antennae that it waved to and fro in the air as it advanced. It was at least double the size of any Gladys had hitherto seen, and her feelings can best be appreciated by those who fear such things. Her blood ran cold. Her flesh crawled. She sat glued to her chair, terrified to move, lest it should run after her. She screamed, and her dresser, startled out of her senses, came flying into the room.
"What is it, madam? What is it?" she cried.
Gladys pointed at the floor.
"Kill it!"
she shrieked.
"Stamp on it! Oh, quick, quick! It is coming towards me!"
But the moment the dresser caught sight of the cockroach, she sprang on a chair and wound her skirts round her.
"Oh, madam," she panted, I daren't go near it. I'm frightened out of my life at beetles. And there's another of them."
And she pointed to the wainscoting.
"And another. Why, the room's full of them."
And so it was. Everywhere Gladys looked she saw beetles crawling towards her, dozens upon dozens, hundreds upon hundreds, and all of the same monstrous size and ultra horrible experience.
"Look!" she screamed. "They are climbing onto my clothes. One's got into my shoes, and another will be in them in a second. Look, there's another, crawling up my cloak, and another on my skirt. Oh, oh!" And her cries and those of the dresser speedily brought a troupe of actors and actresses to the door. The instant, however, the cause of the alarm was ascertained, there were loud yells and a wild stampede down the passages. The stage manager was called, but one glance at the floor was enough for him. He fled. And in the end, 3 of the supers had to be fetched. Hot water, brooms, ashes, and quicklime were used, and although thousands of the cockroaches were killed, thousands more came, and so hopeless did the task of getting rid of them become, that the room eventually had to be vacated, and the cracks under the doors securely sealed. Before Gladys left the theatre, she was called to the telephone. "Who are you?" she asked.
"Hamar," came the reply in insinuating tones. "How do you like the beetles? You'll never see the end of them till—" But Gladys rang off. On her return home, something scuttled across the hall floor in front of her. She sprang back with a scream. It was a gigantic cockroach. The hall was full of them. She summoned the servants, and they set to work to kill them. But they might as well have tried to stop Niagara, for as fast as they squashed one battalion, another took its place. They came out of cracks in the floor, from behind the wainscoting, from every conceivable place in the kitchens, and in a dense black ribbon some 6 inches broad ascended the staircase. Gladys tried to barricade her room against them, but it was of no avail. They came from under the boards of the floor and poured down the chimney. They swarmed over the furniture, in the cupboards, chest of drawers, the washstand, where they kept continually falling into the water. In her clothes, her dressing gown was covered with them. Over the bed, and the climax was reached when they approached the chair she stood on. Too fascinated with horror to move, she watched them crawling up to her. She was thus found by her father. He had come to her assistance in the very nick of time, and after lifting her from the chair and taking her to a place, as yet safe from molestation, returned to her room, where, with savage blows smashing equally beetles and furniture, he remained till daybreak. With the first streak of dawn the beetles decamped, and the fray ended. The work of devastation had been colossal. Corpses were strewn everywhere, and it took the combined household hours before all evidences of the slaughter were obliterated. As for Gladys, she had not slept all night, and was a wreck.
"I can never go through another night of it," she said to Miss Templeton. "Do you think we shall ever get rid of the horrible things?"
"We can but try, dear," Miss Templeton said consolingly. and she accompanied Gladys up to town, where they inquired of doctors and chemists and all sorts of possible and impossible people, and returned to Kew laden with chemicals and patent beetle destroyers. But though they tried remedies by the score, none were of use, and the beetles repeated their performance of the preceding night. Gladys did not go to bed. Surrounded with lighted candles, she sat on the top of a wardrobe till daybreak. The following morning the house was fumigated with sulphur, and people were told off to kill the cockroaches as they made their escape out of doors. By this means an enormous number were killed, but at night they were just as bad as before. An engineer friend then suggested a freezing machine. The temperature of the house was reduced to 10 degrees below zero. The pipes froze and burst next day. The milk froze, the housemaid's toes and the cook's little finger of the left hand froze. Everything froze, and presumably the beetles froze, for there was not one to be seen. However, it was quite impossible to resort again to this extreme measure. John Martin had the most agonizing attacks of lumbago, Gladys had neuralgia, and Miss Templeton a slight touch of pleurisy. When Gladys reached the Imperial that evening, she found that the staff had been battling with cockroaches all day, and that they had at last succeeded in getting rid of them with a fumigation mixture of camphor, cocculus, sulphur, bezonia, and asafoetida, suggested to them by a Hindu student. For the next week not a beetle was to be seen at the theatre, nor at the cottage, and Gladys was beginning to hope that Hamar had ceased plaguing her, in despair of ever winning her, when the persecutions suddenly broke out again. She had been in bed about half an hour, and was falling into a gentle and much needed sleep, when a tremendous rap at the wall, close to her head, awoke her with a start, and set her heart pulsating violently. Thinking it must be some one on the landing, she got up and lit a candle. There was no one there. The moment she got into bed again, the rapping was repeated, and it continued at intervals all night. This went on for a week, during which time Gladys was never once able to sleep. A brief respite ensued, but it was abruptly terminated one morning, when Gladys awoke feeling as if some big insect were attempting to penetrate her body. Uttering a shriek of horror, she whipped the clothes from her and sprang out of bed. Miss Templeton, who slept in the next room, came rushing in, and they saw an enormous insect, half beetle and half scorpion, dart under the pillow. John Martin was fetched, but although he searched everywhere, not a trace of the insect could be found. That night, directly Gladys got in bed and blew out the light, she heard a ticking sound on the sheets, and a huge insect with long, hairy legs ran up her sleeve. Her shrieks brought the whole household to the room, but the insect was nowhere to be seen. She was thus plagued for nearly a fortnight. One insect only, never a number, but only one, of prodigious size and terrifying form, appeared to her in the least suspected places, that is, on the dressing table or chimney piece, in her shoes or pockets, crawled over her in the dark, and could never be caught. These perpetual frights and consequent sleeplessness wore Gladys out. She grew so ill that she had to give up acting, and go into a home to try the rest cure. Hamar then communicated with her through a third person, and offered to leave off tormenting her if she would agree to be engaged to him. "I never will," she said. "Then I will never leave off persecuting you," was his retort. But he was wary. He had no wish to kill her or to damage her looks, so he let her get well, and remain thus for a brief space. When she was once again in full vigour, acting at the Imperial, he recommenced his unwelcome attentions. At first he confined his new plague to the servants at the cottage. The cook was one day turning out a drawer in the kitchen dresser, when she was horrified out of her senses to find squatting there a large black toad, which stared most malevolently at her and then sprang in her face. She shrieked to the housemaid to help her kill it, but before a weapon could be got, the creature had bounced through an open window and disappeared. After this incident the servants knew no peace. Their bedclothes were thrown off them at night, their dresses torn and bespattered with ink, their brushes and combs thrown out of the window, and the water they poured out to wash in was sometimes quite black, sometimes full of a bright green sediment, and sometimes boiling, when it invariably cracked both the jug and basin. Unable to stand these annoyances, the servants left in a body. Their successors fared the same, and worse. Besides having to endure the above named horrors, pebbles were thrown through the windows, their chairs were pulled away as they were about to sit down, the cook, who was one of those upon whom this trick was played, thereby seriously injuring her spine, and all sorts of obstacles were placed on the stairs, so that those who ran down unwarily tripped over them and hurt themselves. 2 successive housemaids broke their legs, whilst another sprained her wrist. The meat, too, was a constant worry. It went so bad that enormous maggots crawled out of it by the thousand and covered the table and floor, and the milk, of which a large quantity was taken daily, turned in a very curious manner. After being deposited in its usual place in the pantry, it began to darken. First of all it became light blue, then deepened into an almost inky blackness, exhibiting curious zigzag lines, and lastly the whole mass began to putrefy and to emit a stench so overpowering that every one in the house retched, and the whole place had to be disinfected. This occurred day after day. Nothing could stop it. The dairyman who supplied the milk did all he could to counteract it. He had his dairies constantly cleansed. He saw that the cattle had a change of food. He bought an entirely new stock of dairy utensils, and no milk was ever sent to the cottage that he had not carefully analysed. The troubles continued for 3 weeks, at the end of which period John Martin received a telephone call from Hamar. "Hello," the latter said. "I guess you've had about enough of it by this time. Wouldn't you like some sweet-smelling milk for a change, or do you prefer to go on till you all get typhoid? The remedy, you know, lies in your own hands. You've only to tell that daughter of yours to accept me, and I'll undertake all your troubles shall cease." "I'll see you hanged first," John Martin said. "Very well then, you old mule," Hamar shouted. "Look out for yourself and Miss Gladys." End of chapter 22. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 23 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 23 Love. To bring about plagues of insects, Hamar had resorted to a very simple method. He had first of all made a wax image representing a cockroach, scorpion, centipede, or whatever other species came into his mind. Then, placing the image he had made in front of him, and repeating the prayer he had learned from the Unknown through the medium of Mrs. Anderson Waite's table, he had concentrated body, soul, and spirit on plaguing Gladys with the insect which the image represented. When his concentration reached the highest degree, insects in their actual physical bodies were transported from the tropics. Footnote 23. There is no doubt that Moses inflicted the plagues with which he tormented Pharaoh in this way. End of footnote. To produce the wrappings on the walls of Gladys's room, he had made a wax representation of a wall, and whilst concentrating to the very utmost, had struck it with his knuckles. The plaguing of the servants Hamar had also accomplished by means of images and concentration. But in order to bewitch milk, he had been obliged to resort to other means. He had converted the mumia of an idiot into a magnes microcosmi, and bribing the man who delivered the milk, he gave him instructions to soak the magnes microcosmi for a few minutes in every portion that he left at the cottage. Footnote 24. In stage 2 this might have been performed by ethereal projection, but Hamar could not resort to this method, as the power of projection had now passed from him. End of footnote. At length Hamar, having failed to gain his object by plaguing Gladys and the servants, set about tormenting John Martin. He made a wax image of the latter, and after pronouncing the necessary prayer, stuck the image full of pins, crying out as he did so, "John Martin, I hate you! John Martin, I curse you! John Martin, a plague on you! and each time Hamar stuck a pin in the image he had made of John Martin, the real John Martin felt an acute pain in the region of his body corresponding to that in which the pin was stuck. The doctor who was called in could make nothing of the malady, but following the etiquette of the profession, cloaked his ignorance with a look of profound wisdom, and the pronouncement that he would tell them in a day or two what was the matter. In the meanwhile, he found it necessary and politic to prescribe a non-committal mixture of chalk and rhubarb, which, although disguised under the usual fanciful pharmacopoeia appellation, did not, however, allay the pain. Sharp, agonizing pricks, now on the neck, now in the chest, now in the most sensitive part of the knee cap, now under the toenail, now, most painful of all, under the finger nail, continued to torment John Martin, who, though as a rule fairly stoical, could not stand these attacks with any degree of composure. He screamed and swore and cursed until the whole household was terrified, and Gladys pretty nearly out of her mind. During a lull, an interval wherein John Martin enjoyed a brief respite, the telephone bell rang. "Hello," called a voice. "I'm Hamar. Haven't you had about enough of it? Remember, you've only to say the word and I'll stop." "Tell him I'll do nothing of the sort," John Martin said. "That he'll never get the better of me this way." Miss Templeton gave the message, and Hamar replied, Wait and see." He then thrust wool, pins, horse nails, straw, needles and moss into the mouth of the image, and John Martin had such frightful pains in his stomach that he went into convulsions, and after an emetic had been given him, vomited up all the above named articles, save the pins and needles, which worked their way out through his flesh, causing him the most exquisite tortures. Gladys, having given up on going to the theatre in order to be with her father during these attacks, now declared that she could no longer bear to see him in such excruciating pain, whilst it was in her power to prevent it.
"Tell him," she said, "tell Hamar you'll accept his conditions. Don't think of me. I would rather do anything than see you suffer like this."
"I can hold out a bit longer," he groaned. "At any rate, I needn't give in yet." Every now and then there came a respite, perhaps for several hours, perhaps for several days, then the tortures recommenced. And always John Martin steeled himself to bear them. At last came the climax. Hamar, infuriated that his efforts so far had proved fruitless, resolved, since time was pressing, to play his trump card and either win or lose all. He rang up Gladys on the telephone. "My patience is exhausted," he said. "I'll give you one more chance, and one only. Agree to be engaged to me at once, or I'll smite your father with the most virulent form of cancer and leave him to die." There was no question now in Gladys's mind as to what she should do. Of all things in the world she dreaded cancer most, and after the many evidences Hamar had given her of his skill in black magic, she did not doubt for one instant he could immediately he chose carry out his threat.
"I have decided," she said faintly, to give in."
"You accept me then?" Hamar said.
"Yes."
"When may I see you?"
"When you like."
"Then I'll come at once," Hamar replied. "Au revoir." But Hamar, when he arrived at the cottage, did not realize any of the gleeful anticipations he had indulged in en route. Gladys was ill, so Miss Templeton informed him, at the same time begging him, if he really had any regard for Miss Martin, not to ask to see her for the next few days; and to this request Hamar, seeing no alternative, was obliged to consent. Shortly after he had gone, Shiel Davenport called, and found Gladys alone in the garden.
"I have been told your father is ill," he said, "and should like to hear better news of him. How is he?" "I think he's all right now," Gladys replied, "but he has suffered frightfully. Indeed, we've all had a terrible time," and she told him what had happened. "Then you've not been acting at the Imperial lately?" Shiel asked. "Not for the past week," Gladys replied. "I couldn't leave father." "How has Mr. Bromley Burnham got on without you?" Shiel asked bitterly. "I don't understand you," Gladys said quietly. "I have an understudy, and from what I am told she has given every satisfaction. I have some news which I fear won't be altogether welcome to you." Shiel turned a shade paler. "What is it?" he faltered. I'm engaged to be married."
For a few moments there was silence, and then Shiel exclaimed mechanically, "Engaged to be married? To whom?"
"To Leon Hamar. I couldn't help it,"
and she explained the position. "But he'll never keep you to it," Shiel said. "You couldn't be such a brute."
"I'm afraid he will," Gladys replied. "He's shown pretty clearly that he's capable of anything. I've given him my promise. I must keep it."
"Then it's good bye to all interest in life for me," Shiel said, with a gulp. "I've thought of no one but you since we first met. For you, in the hope of some day winning you, I've struggled on. I've reconciled myself to a bare existence. Now I've lost you. I've lost everything. I hate life. I shall " "You'll do nothing of the sort," Gladys interrupted, "unless you want me to regret ever having met you. I wonder that you say, 'I've nothing to live for,' when we can still be friends, and when you can, at least, win my respect by putting your shoulder to the wheel and exerting yourself to the utmost to get on." "And you? What about you?"
"Never mind me. I can well look after myself."
"You'll live in hell!" Shiel cried, her eyes goading him to madness. "Even though you may not care for me, I do not choose to stand quietly by whilst you spend your life in purgatory. Hamar has won you through some diabolical trickery, and if I can't thwart him in any other way, I'll kill him. He shan't marry you."
"He will," Gladys sighed. "No one can stop him. He is omnipotent."
Apparently Gladys's statement was more or less true, and 99 men out of 100, in the same circumstances as Shiel, would have now recognized the hopelessness of the situation. But Shiel was abnormal. As he walked home from the cottage that evening he kept on repeating to himself, "Gladys is my goal. I want only Gladys. I'll have only Gladys." And having once made up his mind to get Gladys, it seemed to him as if out of every obstacle that lay between him and Gladys, he could and would merely make a stepping stone. "Since," he argued to himself, "all's fair in love and war, I'll win Gladys through another woman." And he straightway telephoned to Lilian Rosenberg to have tea with him. The latter had already made an engagement for the afternoon, but all the same she accepted Shiel's invitation. "Will you do me a favour?" he asked.
"If it is anything that lies in my power," she said. "What is it?"
"I want you to find out how Hamar works his spells. I asked you before?"
"I know you did, and I've not forgotten," Lilian said, "but I have to be very careful. I've played the part of eavesdropper once or twice, and heard enough to confirm me in my suspicions that Hamar is in touch with evil occult powers. I've heard him praying aloud to them on more than one occasion, and I've also a shrewd idea he performs at least some of his spells by means of wax images. But why do you want to know?"
"Only curiosity. I am intensely interested in the occult."
"You don't want to start a rival show, do you?"
Lilian asked jestingly. "With a maximum capital of £2 and a minimum of knowledge," Shiel laughed, "hardly. I wish I could. I would offer you the post of manageress."
"Partner."
"Well, partner if you like. Would you take it?"
"Perhaps," she said, looking at him with a sudden shyness. "What a pity you are not rich. Can't you get a post that would bring you in about £200 a year for a start? I believe you really want something to stimulate you, to make you work in grim earnest, and then you would succeed. There's grit in you. I love grit, but at present it's latent. It wants bringing out."
"You are very kind," Shiel said, "but I'm afraid I'm a hopeless case, and, being such, have no business to be in your company. Will you come to the theatre with me?"
"The theatre? When you've no business to be in my company, and when it is as much as you can do to pay the rent of a back attic?"
"Oh, never mind that. I've had tickets given me. I've been doing odd bits of journalism lately, and a dramatic critic I know has given me 2 stalls at the Imperial."
"The Imperial!"
Lilian Rosenberg ejaculated.
"That's where Gladys Martin is acting. Surely I can't bear her."
"She's not the only person in the cast," Shiel observed drily, "and the play's a good one. Do come." With a little more persuasion Shiel gained her consent, and both he and she enjoyed the play, or more correctly speaking, the occasion, immensely. So long as Gladys was on the stage, Shiel's eyes never once left her. whilst throughout the performance Lilian Rosenberg saw only Shiel, thought only of Shiel. The interest she had taken in him, the interest she had so confidently asserted was only interest, had grown apace, had grown out of all recognition. It needed only a fillip now to convert the interest into something warmer, and the fillip was not long in coming. Shiel was seeing Lilian home to her lodgings in Margaret Terrace, a turning off Oakley Street, when a man knocked a woman down right in front of them. He was just the ordinary type of street ruffian, the whitewashed English labourer, and the woman, having without doubt been served by him in the same manner 50 times before, was probably well used to such treatment. But it was more than Shiel, who had spent so much of his life where they treat women differently, could stand, and before Lilian Rosenberg had time to remonstrate, he had rushed up to the prostrate woman and was holding the man at bay. A scuffle now began in which the woman, whom Shiel had helped regain her feet, joined. Both man and woman now attacked Shiel, who, placing himself with his back against the railings, defended himself as best he could. The hour was late. There were no police about, and it seemed only too probable that the fracas would end in a tragedy. The labourer was a burly fellow, shorter than Shiel, but far broader and heavier, and anyone could see at a glance that Shiel stood no chance against him. Lilian Rosenberg, at her wits' end to know what to do, ran into Oakley Street, and there was no one in sight. She made for the nearest lighted house and rang the bell furiously. A man came to the door, whom, unheeding his expostulations, she caught by the arm and dragged into the street. They arrived on the scene of action just as the ruffian, breaking through Shiel's guard, struck him a terrific blow on the forehead, which sent him reeling against the railings. The newcomer, upon whom both man and woman, seeing Shiel incapacitated, instantly turned, would probably have shared the same fate had not the occupants of several of the neighbouring houses, amongst whom were some half dozen athletic young men, roused by the noise, came out into the street, and the ruffian and his companion, seeing the odds were against them, decamped. Shiel had not fully regained consciousness when Lilian Rosenberg, regardless of propriety, led him into her sitting room, bathed his forehead, dosed him with brandy, and making up a bed for him on the sofa, bade him rest there till the morning. When he took his departure he had quite recovered, and Lilian Rosenberg had at last realized that she loved him. End of chapter 23. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 24 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 24 The Subpoena. A few days after the incident in Margaret Terrace, Shiel had an inspiration. He was lunching with an old schoolfellow, whom, quite by chance, he had met in Lincoln's Inn, having previously lost sight of him for many years, and the conversation, which had at first been confined to the old days, had gradually drifted to what was ever upmost in Shield's mind, namely the modern Sorcery Company, that is, Hamar, Kelson and Curtis. "Did you know," his friend remarked, "that the old statute introduced in Henry V's reign against sorcery has never been repealed?" "You don't mean to say so!" Shield cried excitedly, a vague idea dawning on him. "Tell me all about it." "Well, that's rather a long order. For one thing, it imposes all kinds of penalties, from capital punishment to fines. For another, it was in force up to the beginning of George III's reign, when the last case of a person being burned for witchery in England occurred, and since then it has fallen into disuse." "Could it be revived?" Shiel asked, a sudden wild hope surging through him. "For all I know to the contrary, it could," his friend, who, by the way, was a barrister, replied. "Of course no one could be burned or hanged under it, but they might be fined or imprisoned." "Then I wish to goodness you would file a case against the Modern Sorcery Company. I'd move heaven and earth to get the scoundrels sent to prison." And he told his friend how matters stood between Gladys and Hamar. The barrister, whose name was Sevening, H.V. Sevening, of T.C.D. and Cheltenham College renown, was keenly interested. It was not only that his sense of chivalry was stirred, but he saw sport. Consequently, the foregoing conversation resulted in a prosecution, which, taking place some 4 weeks later, was reported in the London Herald as follows: Extraordinary charge heard at the Old Bailey. Revival of an ancient statute. Yesterday, at the Old Bailey, before His Honour Judge Rocher, Leon Hamar, Edward Curtis, and Matthew Kelson, of the Modern Sorcery Company Limited, were indicted under the 23rd of Henry V, c. 15, which makes it a capital offence to practise and administer spells. The case for the prosecution promises to be a lengthy one. An enormous number of witnesses who are most anxious to make statements will be called, and it is anticipated that much of their evidence will be of a most extraordinary nature. The accused are cited with having worked spells to the injury, which injury, in many instances, has been fatal, of a vast number of people, representing every rank in life. Hilda, Countess of Ramsgate, who appeared in heavy mourning, was the first witness called. In her evidence she stated that it was owing to an advertisement she had seen in the Ladies' Meadow that she had consulted the Modern Sorcery Company Limited with the object of buying a spell to prevent her Pekingese pet Brutus catching colds in his liver. She had hoped to see Mr. Kelson, as she had heard that he was more sympathetic, where ladies were concerned, than either Mr. Hamar or Mr. Curtis, but as Mr. Kelson was engaged, she had consulted Mr. Edward Curtis instead. The latter had given her a spell which he had assured her would have the desired effect, but directly she got home her adored Brutus developed melancholia and died raving mad, after having bitten her child, who, by the way, had died too. For the defence, Gerald Kirby, K.C., declared that the spell his client had given the Countess was perfectly harmless, that it could not possibly have produced either melancholia or madness. Can any dependence, he said, be placed on a woman who obviously thinks more of her dog's death than that of her child? The court was adjourned till to morrow. In the following day's paper the evidence for the prosecution was continued. Lady Marjorie Tatler, who in the weekly and illustrated journals, for no other reason than her reputed beauty, was introduced over and over again to the long suffering public, was the first to step into the witness box. She declared that Edward Curtis, instead of giving her a spell to make Florilda win the Derby, had given her a diabolical something that brought out spots all over her face, and that she had to undergo a most expensive treatment before they could be got rid of. In cross-examination, Lady Marjorie Tatler admitted that she had asked Edward Curtis for a spell that would cause all the horses running in that particular race, save Florilda, to be taken ill. For the defence, Gerald Kirby, K.C., explained that his client was so disgusted at the immorality of Lady Marjorie's request that he had purposely given her a spell that would have no effect upon a horse, and could not possibly bring out spots on her ladyship's face. The spell Edward Curtis gave her, Gerald Kirby said, was a mixture of hemp seed and sago, flavoured with violet powder, and my client instructed her ladyship to wear it next her heart. Loud laughter. Lady Coralie Mars, the next witness, who declared she had sought a spell to make the man she was forced into marrying fall into a trance just before the marriage ceremony was to take place, and that instead of bringing this about, the spell Edward Curtis had sold her had caused her to have St. Vitus's dance, was adroitly trapped into admitting that she had really wanted her fiancé smitten with paralysis. A wish, Gerald Kirby announced, with a dramatic flourish of his hands, that so aroused my client's indignation that instead of giving her the spell she wanted, he gave her one that would make her affianced husband more than ever hungry for the marriage hour to arrive. As for St. Vitus's dance, would any woman with an emotional and hysterical nature, such as obviously was that of Lady Coralie Mars, ever be free from such a complaint? The Honourable Augusta Mapple, who stated that she had visited the Modern Sorcery Company for the purpose of obtaining a spell to bring about a defeat of the Government, by afflicting the bulk of their supporters with such bilious attacks as would necessitate their absence from the house, and that instead of giving her such a spell, Edward Curtis had given her one which had caused every member of her household to fall downstairs, admitted, under cross-examination, that she had asked for a spell that would make every supporter of the Government in the house be suddenly seized with tetanus. "A diabolical request, your lordship," Gerald Kirby said, "and one to which my client could not possibly accede. Consequently, as punishment for such cruelty, he sold her a spell that would result in her having a sharp attack of toothache. It could not possibly have produced any of the mishaps she attributes to it." It is unnecessary to quote further. By far the greater number of these witnesses, on being cross-examined by Mr. Kirby, who defended with an ability that has rarely if ever been excelled, were made to confess that they had wanted the spells for a far more subtle and dangerous purpose than they had previously stated, admissions which, of course, were highly prejudicial to the case for the prosecution. Shiel lost hope. He had looked forward to the trial with an excitement that almost bordered on frenzy. It was never out of his mind. He thought of it at meals, he thought of it at his work, he thought of it out of doors, and when he went to bed he dreamed of it. I'll save you yet," he wrote to Gladys. "The trial can only result in one thing, the breaking up and imprisonment of the trio." But when he read the papers each day and saw how in almost every instance evidence which ought to have been damning to the accused had been twisted into their favour, his heart sank. There was only one chance now, Lilian Rosenberg. She, of all the staff employed in the hall in Cockspur Street, was best acquainted with the modus operandi of Messrs. Hamar, Curtis and Kelson. "We must get a hold of that girl at all costs," H.V. Sevenning remarked to Shiel. "You say you feel sure she likes you. Work upon her feelings to show the firm up." "I don't much like the idea of it," Shiel said, "but I suppose the end justifies the means." "Of course it does," Sevenning retorted. "It's your only chance of saving Miss Martin." Acting on this suggestion, Shiel approached Lilian Rosenberg on the subject. "What about the spells?" he asked her. "Have you found out yet how Hamar works them?" "I have only heard him muttering in his room again," she said, her cheeks paling, "and you will only laugh at me. I have seen queer shadows hovering in his doorway, stealing down the passages, shadows that terrified me. I never knew what real fear was before I came to Cockspur Street, and for the past few weeks I have been almost too afraid to open my room door, for fear I would see something standing outside." "You have no doubt, I suppose, in your mind that the trio practise sorcery?" "I certainly think they are helped in all they do by evil spirits." "Do you approve of such proceedings?" "I don't think them right. I don't think we have any right to pry into the unknown. Some day, undoubtedly, it will be given us to know, but until that day comes we had far better leave it alone." "If you think like that," Shiel said, "how can you reconcile yourself to working for this people?" "How can I help myself?" Lilian Rosenberg answered. "Beggars can't be choosers. I am not responsible for what they do." "But supposing you knew they were about to commit a very heinous crime, wouldn't you feel it your duty to try and circumvent them?" "That depends," Lilian Rosenberg said. "If I could stop them without running any risk of losing my post, then I would probably try to stop them. But if stopping them meant being sacked, I most certainly shouldn't. It isn't easy to get posts nowadays, especially good paying posts like this. What do you take me for, a fool?" "Then you don't believe in self-sacrifice even for a friend?" Shiel said slowly. "That depends on the degree of friendship," Lilian replied. "If it were for someone I liked very much, then perhaps." "Is there anyone you like very much? I somehow can't fancy you being very fond of anyone." "Couldn't you?" Lilian said with a faint sigh. "You don't think me capable of any deep affection? You forget, perhaps, that a woman doesn't always wear her heart on her sleeve." "I confess I don't understand women," Shiel said, "and I had best come to the point at once. I happen to know that the trio, or at least one of the trio, is contemplating doing something ultra abominable, a cruel and shameful wrong, which I particularly wish to prevent. But I may not be able to do anything without your help. Will you help me?" "How can I? Lilian asked. "Why, by finding out something which might be damning evidence against them, or by stating your opinion in court. There is only one way of staying the trio from doing this dastardly thing, and that is by getting this case, which is now being tried, to go against them." "Well, and supposing by some chance the defendants should win, what would become of me?" "Ah, that is where your self sacrifice would come in. It would be a noble action." "How does this wrong you say they are about to perpetrate touch on you personally?" "It touches on someone with whom I am personally acquainted." "Someone you like?" "Yes." "A relation?" "That I can't say." "Then I can't help you. I am naturally inquisitive. Curiosity is, as you know, a woman's privilege. You must tell me all." "It's for a friend, then." "A man?" "No," Shiel replied, "for a girl." There was an emphatic silence, and then Lilian Rosenberg spoke. "Have I ever heard you mention her?" "Occasionally," Shiel replied. There was silence again. Then Lilian Rosenberg said slowly, "You surely don't mean Gladys Martin? I can think of no one else." "I do mean her," Shiel replied, dropping his eyes. "She is to be coerced into marrying Hamar." "The silly fool!" Lilian Rosenberg said. "I would like to see anyone trying to coerce me, and it is to serve her you want me to sacrifice myself," and she turned away in disgust. After this interview Lilian studiously avoided Shiel, and despairing at length of ever winning her over, Shiel reported his failure to H.V. Sevenning. "We must subpoena her," said Sevenning. "You'll never get her to speak that way," Shiel said. "If once she has made up her mind not to do a thing, nothing will ever compel her." "I have heard that said of people before," H.V. Sevenning replied drily, "but it's wonderful what the witness box can do. It loosens the most mulish tongues in a marvellous manner." "It wouldn't hers," Shiel maintained. H.V. Sevenning, however, thought he knew best. What lawyer doesn't? Moreover, it was all part of the game, the great game of becoming notorious at all costs. He served the subpoena. Like most modern girls, Lilian Rosenberg was wholly selfish, and for this fault only her parents were to blame. She had been brought up with the one idea of pleasing herself, of saying and doing exactly what she thought fit, and no one had ever thwarted her. Now, however, the unforeseen had happened. She was smitten with the grand passion, and confronted for the first time in her life with the startling proposition of self sacrifice. She loved Shiel. She wouldn't marry him for the very simple reason he had no money, but that only added poignancy to the situation. She loved him all the more. She knew Shiel loved Gladys Martin. Whether he could ever marry Gladys Martin was another matter, but he loved her all the same. And the proposition that had been so abruptly thrust upon Lilian Rosenberg was that she should sacrifice herself, not only to save Gladys Martin from marrying Hamar, but to pave the way for Shiel, supposing Gladys could reconcile herself to penury, or marry herself. In other words, she had been called upon to give up what was, at the moment, dearest to her in the world, and to court all the inconveniences and worries of being thrown out of employment. For if she gave evidence that would in any way tend to damage the firm of Hamar, Curtis and Kelson, she would undoubtedly lose her post, and in all probability never get another, at least not another as good, for the sake of a woman whom she did not know, but nevertheless hated. Yet there was in her, as there is in almost every girl, however up to date, a chord responded to the heroic. A short time back she would have scoffed at the very thought of self-sacrifice, but now she actually caught herself considering it. She kept on considering it, too, until the trial was well advanced, and had practically made up her mind to denounce the trio and go to the wall herself, when the subpoena was served. End of chapter 24. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 25 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. CHAPTER XXV CURTIS in a New Role. In an instant Lilian Rosenberg had decided the course she would adopt.
"What a disgusting thing to do!" she indignantly exclaimed. "I wouldn't have believed it of Shiel. The idea of forcing me to give evidence, of forcing me to save the situation for the sake of the woman he thinks he loves. I shan't do it."
And she proved as good as her word. Apart from her importance as a witness, considerable interest attached to her on account of her appearance, and she was infinitely more attractive than any of the women who had hitherto appeared in the witness box, though many of them were so called society beauties. "You are wrong," was the look which Shiel read in H.V. Sevening's eyes as Lilian Rosenberg took the oath. "She is on our side." But simple as Shiel was in many ways, he knew women better than the lawyer, and the exceedingly sweet expression Lilian Rosenberg had assumed, which he knew to be quite foreign to her, filled him with misgivings. Nor was he mistaken. The evidence she gave was entirely in favour of the trio. The case for the prosecution was concluded. For the defence, Gerald Kirby, K.C., resorted to satire. He characterized the whole proceedings as the most absurd heard in any court for the past 2 centuries, and wondered only that it had been possible to procure a counsel for such a ridiculous prosecution. "Even though," he remarked, "spirits such as have been specified by the prosecution do exist, which is extremely dubious, there has never been yet produced any reliable corroborative evidence respecting them, and the prosecution has wholly failed to prove that it is through the medium of these spirits that the modern sorcery company have worked their spells. The marvellous feats that we have all seen performed in Cockspur Street have been accomplished, as the defendants have all long stated, through will, sheer will power and nothing else. And I intend producing evidence to show that the secret of the wonderful efficacy of all the charms and spells sold by the Sorcery Company lies in will power too. Whenever they have been consulted with regard to the purchasing of a spell, the firm have invariably pointed out this fact to the purchasers, carefully explaining at the same time that the rings, lockets and other articles sold to them were merely to assist them in concentration. It is ridiculous to suppose that such trivial articles could have produced, of themselves, such calamities as the witnesses for the prosecution attributed to them. But of course you did not believe the statements of such witnesses. How could you? How could you expect anything but falsehood from women who, upon cross-examination, had owned that their object in obtaining the spells was a far more dangerous object than they had at first led you to suppose? They sought spells that would do evil, and that evil was not accomplished. Now, I ask you, if the firm worked their spells through the instrumentality of evil spirits, for it is assuredly only evil spirits that are associated with sorcery, would not the spells they sold naturally have brought about the sinister results for which they were required? Undoubtedly they would, and they failed to produce the desired effect, simply because their efficacy depended not on spirit agency, but on human will power, which power one could only too plainly see the society ladies who had witnessed for the prosecution did not possess. It may be asked why the defendants, if they do not accomplish their spells through black magic, style themselves the Sorcery Company, and so mislead the public. Obviously they do so purely for advertisement. The Sorcery Company is an attractive title, a catchy title, and for this reason, which is surely a legitimate one since it is strictly in accordance with the prevailing custom of advertisement, the firm of Hamar, Curtis and Kelson adopted it. They did not expect, they were not so extraordinarily foolish as to expect anyone would take them literally. They thought, as you and I think, that sorcery cannot be taken seriously, that it is confined to fairy tales, and that as a fairy tale it is potent only in the nursery. This was the gist of the counsel's speech for the defence. A number of witnesses then gave evidence for the defendants, and when the prosecuting counsel rose, it was only too evident that he was pleading for a lost cause. The court, with ill-concealed derision, barely accorded him a hearing. 2 hours later, the Meteor, always the first in the field when sensations crop up, headed the first column of their front page with "Collapse of the Sorcery Case. Crushing speech by Gerald Kirby, K.C. Acquittal of the defendants." The judge, so the Meteor reported, expressed himself in absolute agreement with the defending counsel. The action, he said, ought never to have been brought. It was sublimely ridiculous to accuse anyone of being in league with forces in the existence of which no sane person could possibly believe. Shiel was in despair. All chance of saving Gladys seemed to be fast disappearing. He telephoned to her and was answered by Miss Templeton. "Gladys," she said, "had gone out with Hamar, who had motored down to the cottage the moment the trial was over and the verdict known." "I wish to God we had won the case," Shiel observed. "So do I," Miss Templeton replied, "and so did Gladys. She regards her position now as absolutely hopeless." "Tell her not to lose heart," Shiel answered hurriedly. "If I can't find another means, I'll—" But Miss Templeton rang off, and he spoke to the wind. Full of wrath against Lilian Rosenberg, he went round to see her, and met her just as she was entering her house. "I've come to see you for the last time," he announced. "After the way you behaved in court, we can no longer be friends." "I don't understand," she said in a rather faltering voice. "What have I done?" "Only perjured yourself," Shiel retorted. "The tale you told the judge was very different to the tale you told me, therefore it is impossible for us to continue our friendship. I could never have anything to do with a woman whose word I can't rely upon, whose character I scorn, whom I despise and," he was going to add, "detest," but checked himself, and unable to trust himself in her presence any longer, he gave her a glance of the utmost contempt, and wheeling around, walked quickly away. As in a dream, Lilian Rosenberg went upstairs to her pillow, and throwing herself on the bed, buried her face in the pillow and indulged in a fit of crying. It was not the thought of losing Shiel that was so painful to her. She might have grown reconciled to that. It was the thought of losing his esteem. Most people would agree with her, would assure her she had done the right thing in looking after number one. "What, after all, is perjury?" she argued. "Nearly everyone in this world perjure themselves at one time or another. Certainly all women." But it was not the opinion of the majority she cared about. It was the respect of the one. The respect she had wilfully and spitefully sacrificed. Was it too late to recover it? With regard to Gladys, she was very sceptical. The reluctance to accept Hamar as her future husband she still believed to be all pretence, and she felt convinced that Gladys, in her heart of hearts, was only too glad to get the chance of marrying any one so rich. This being so, she could not bring herself to think she had done Shiel any actual wrong. Gladys would never marry him. The only person she had harmed was herself. She had lied, and Shiel was not the sort of man to condone an offence of that sort easily. Still, weeping would do no good. It would only make her ugly. She got up, had tea, and went out. She could think better in the open air. It soothed her. For some reason or other, customs perhaps, she strolled towards Cockspur Street, and there ran into one of the few people she particularly wished to avoid, Kelson. He was delighted to see her. "It's nectar to me to be out again," he said. "Jerusalem! It was awful in the courts. Have supper with me." It was a fine starlight night, the air cool and refreshing, and a wild abandonment seized Lilian Rosenberg. She would have supped with the devil had he asked her. "I've nothing to lose now," she said to herself. "Nothing. I'll have my fling." "Where shall we go?" she asked. "It must be somewhere entertaining." "Why not to my rooms?" he said. "We can talk better there. We shall be all alone." She raised no objection, and they were about to step into a taxi when Hamar and Curtis suddenly put in appearance. "Matt!" Hamar cried, seizing his elbow. "I want a word with you." "Not now," Kelson protested, looking hungrily at Lilian. "Yes, now," Hamar said. "At once. I shan't keep you more than 5 minutes," and he dragged Kelson away with him. The moment they had gone, Curtis, who was obviously the worse for drink, addressed Lilian. "Kelson won't come back," he said. "Hamar is mad with him. He says if he ever sees you two together again, he'll sack you. Let me take his place." A sudden inspiration came to her. There were one or two things she badly wanted to know, and with a bit of coaxing, Curtis, in his present state, might tell her anything. She would try. "All right," she said, "I'll come." They got into the taxi, and Curtis, as far as his fuddled senses would allow, made violent love to her. After supper they had supper in his rooms he grew a deal more amorous. She let him sit close beside her. She let him put his arm round her waist. But before she let him kiss her, she struck her bargain. "No," she said, thrusting him away. "Not just yet. That can come later, if you are good. I want you to tell me something first. About this marriage of Mr. Hamar and Miss Martin. Is it likely to come off?"
"Is it likely?" Curtis said with a stupid leer. "Is it likely?" "Not much. Leon means nothing. He only wants the fun of being engaged to a pretty girl, like I wantsh fun with you. Nothing more."
"Then he'll throw her over after a while?"
"After he gets what he wants to get."
"And suppose she prove different to what he expects?"
"After he passes stage 7, that will be all right," Curtis said, giving her waist an emphatic squeeze. "Everybody will be all right then. You and Matt, for example, and I and Whisky."
"Stage 7? What do you mean?"
"Why, don't you know?" Curtis gurgled.
And then a sudden gleam of intelligence came into his watery eyes. He added,
"Then I shan't tell you. Nothing shall make me. It's a secret."
"I won't kiss you till you do," Lilian Rosenberg said.
"I'll make you."
"Oh, no, you won't," Lilian Rosenberg cried, disengaging herself from his grasp and rising. "Don't you dare touch me. I'm going."
Curtis watched her with a helpless grin. Then he suddenly cried out,
"Come back! Come back, I say!"
"Well, will you do as I want?" Lilian Rosenberg said.
"I'll do anything to please you, if only you stay with me."
She sat down, and his arm once again encircled her.
"Now," she said, pushing his face away, "tell me."
Bit by bit she drew out of him the whole history of the compact with the Unknown, how in stage 5, the stage they were about to enter, they would have fresh powers conferred upon them, their present power, that is, of working spells and causing diseases, being then cancelled; how they would obtain supreme power over women when they reached the final stage, stage 7, and how the compact would be broken and their ruin brought about should either of them marry or should anything happen before this final stage was reached, to disunite them. Lilian could account for a great deal now. The uncanny feelings she had always experienced in the building, the curious enigmatical shadows she had seen hovering about the doorways and flitting down the passages, the extraordinary nature of the feats and spells, Hamar's mutterings and his fury, whenever Kelson spoke to her, were no longer wholly unintelligible. But she must know all. She must be most exacting. Finally she got from Curtis everything there was to be got from him, and she laughed immoderately when he excused himself on the grounds that it was all Leon's doings. Leon had told him to offer her a little compensation for the loss of her escort.
"And you have compensated me more than enough," Lilian Rosenberg said. "Now you shall have your reward." And she kissed him 3 times for luck.
"But you're not going," he said, staggering to his feet and attempting to hold her. "You're not going till the rosy morning sun shines saucily in on us."
"Oh, yes, I am," she said. "I've had quite enough of you. Good bye."
And before he could prevent her, she had run to the front door and let herself out. End of chapter 25. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 26 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 26 In Hyde Park at Night. But now that Lilian Rosenberg was possessed of all this information respecting the trio, she was once again in doubt how to act, or whether to act at all. Supposing she were to attempt to warn Gladys Martin against Hamar, how would Gladys take the warning? Would she pay any attention to it? The odds were she would not. That having set her heart on marrying Hamar for his money, she would blind herself to his faults and resolutely shut her ears to anything said against him. Also, there was the very great possibility of Gladys being rude to her, and even the thought of this was more than she could bear to contemplate. If only Shiel were reasonable! If only he could be made to see how utterly ridiculous it was for him to think of winning such a girl as Gladys. Gladys, the pretty, dolly-faced, pampered actress, who had never known a single hardship, had always had a well-lined purse, and would never, never marry poverty. Then back to Lilian Rosenberg's mind came her parting with Shiel. She recalled his intense scorn and indignation. A liar! He did not wish to have anything to do with a liar. It's a good thing every man is not so fastidious, she said to herself bitterly, or the population of the world would soon fizz out. She laughed. He had never questioned her morals in any other sense. Perhaps, in his innocence, or assumed innocence, he had thought them spotless. At all events, he had most graciously ignored them. But a liar he could not put up with. And why? Because the lie had touched him on a sore point. When lies do not touch a sore point, they too are ignored. She walked to the Imperial and looked again at Gladys's photographs. How any man could fall madly in love with such a face was more than she could conceive. It was a mincing, maudlin, finicking face. It irritated her intensely. She turned away from it in disgust, yet came back to have another look. And yet another. God knows why. It fascinated her. Finally she left it, fully resolved to let its odious original go to her fate without a warning. Soon after her return to the hall in Cockspur Street, she was sent for by Hamar. "Didn't I tell you," he said, "that you were on no account to encourage Mr. Kelson?" "You did," Lilian Rosenberg replied. "Will you kindly explain then," Hamar said, "why you have disobeyed my orders?" "How have I disobeyed them?" Lilian Rosenberg asked. "How?" Hamar retorted, his cheeks white with passion. "You dare to inquire how? Why, you were on the point of accompanying him to his rooms last night to supper, when I stopped you. I have overlooked your disobedience so many times that I can do so no longer. Your services will not be required by the firm after to day fortnight." "Won't they?" Lilian Rosenberg replied, her anger rising. "I think you are mistaken. I know a great deal too much to make it safe for you to part with me. I know, for instance, all about your compact with the Unknown." "You know nothing," Hamar said, his voice faltering. "Oh, yes, I do," Lilian Rosenberg answered. "I know everything. I know how you first got in communication with the Unknown in San Francisco. I know how you receive fresh powers from the Unknown every 3 months, the old powers being cancelled. I know the penalty you will undergo should the compact be broken, and, what is more, I know how the compact can be broken." "How the deuce have you learned all this?" Hamar stammered. "Never mind. Am I to remain in your service, or leave?" "I think," Hamar said, stroking his chin thoughtfully, "it is better that you should remain. Better for all parties. I owe you some little recompense for your loyalty to the firm, and for the admirable way you spoke up for the firm in court. I will make you out a cheque for £100 now, and your salary shall be doubled at the end of the week. Promise to keep out of Mr. Kelson's way in the future, for the next 6 months at any rate. After that time you may see him as often as you like, and I will give you as a wedding present a cheque for £20,000. £20,000! You are joking." "I'm not. I vow and declare I mean it. Is that a bargain?"
"I will certainly think it well over," Lilian Rosenberg said, "and let you know my decision later on." From what Curtis had told her, she knew it was the last day of Stage 4, that the trio that evening would be initiated into Stage 5, the stage of cures, and a mad desire seized her to witness the initiation. But how would the Unknown manifest itself on this occasion, and to which of the trio? She could not keep a close watch on the three of them. If only she had been friends with Shiel, they might, in some way, have worked it together. Curtis had carefully avoided her since the supper, but she had seen Kelson, and he had looked at her each time he met her as if he yearned to fall down at her feet and worship her. Should she attach herself to him for the evening, and run the risk of another quarrel with Hamar? She dearly loved risks and dangers, and the danger she would encounter in defying Hamar appealed to her sporting nature. It was easy to secure Kelson. One glance from her eyes, and he would have followed her to Timbuktu. "Charing Cross, under clock, after show to night," she whispered as she flew hurriedly past him. "I want to speak to you." Now it so happened that Hamar had given Kelson orders to return to his rooms directly the performance was over, and to remain in them till morning, in case he was wanted in connection with the initiation. But he might have spared himself the trouble. It was Lilian, and Lilian only, that Kelson now thought of. It was Lilian, and Lilian only, that he would obey. The idea of meeting her, of having her all to himself, of being able to do her a service, filled him with such uncontrollable delight that he hardly knew how to comport himself so as not to arouse Hamar's suspicions. Directly the performance was over, he sneaked out of the hall, and pretending not to hear Hamar, who called after him, he jumped into a taxi and was whirled away to the trysting place. Lilian Rosenberg, who arrived a moment later, was dressed in a new costume, and Kelson thought her looking smarter and daintier than ever. "You shall kiss me at once," she said, "if you promise me one thing." "And what is that?" he asked, looking hungrily at her lips. "I want you to let me see the Unknown when it comes to you to night," she said. "Good God! What do you know about the Unknown?" he exclaimed, his jaws falling and a look of terror creeping into his eyes. "A great deal," she laughed. "So much that I want to learn more." And of what she knew she told him, just as much as she had told Hamar. "And now," she said, "I repeat my promise. You shall have a kiss. Think of that. If only you will hide me somewhere so that I can see the Unknown or its emissary." "I would do anything for a kiss," Kelson said, "but I fear it is impossible to fulfill the condition, because I haven't the remotest idea where or when the Unknown will appear. Besides, it is just as likely to go to Hamar or Curtis as to come to me, and up to the present I haven't felt the remotest suggestion of its favouring me. Is this the only condition I can fulfil so that you will let me kiss you?" "Certainly," Lilian Rosenberg replied. "I am not in the habit of being kissed. Such an event can only happen in the most exceptional and privileged circumstances. Such, for example, as exist at the present moment, when I ask you to put yourself to some considerable trouble, if not actually to incur danger, in order to accomplish what I wish." "And yet I remember kissing you unconditionally," Kelson commented. "Memory is a fickle thing," Lilian Rosenberg replied, "and so is woman. Times have changed. I'll leave you at once unless you promise to do your very utmost to grant my request." Kelson promised, and, after they had had supper at the Trocadero, suggested that they should take a stroll in Hyde Park. "I hope you are not awfully shocked," he inquired rather anxiously, "but a sudden impulse has come over me to go there. I believe it is the will of the Unknown. Will you come with me?" "We shan't be able to get in, shall we? It's so late," Lilian Rosenberg said. "Otherwise, I should like to. I'm rather in a mood for adventure." "They don't shut the gates till 12," Kelson said, "and it's not that yet." "Very well, let's go then. I'm game to go anywhere to see the Unknown." And so saying, Lilian rose from the table, and Kelson followed her into the street. They took a taxi, and alighting at Hyde Park Corner, entered the park. It was very dark and deserted. "It's nearly closing time," a policeman called out to them rather curtly. "We are only taking a constitutional," Kelson explained. "We shall be back in 5 minutes."
They crossed the road to the statue, and were deliberating which direction to take, when they heard a groan. "It's only some poor devil of a tramp," Kelson said. "The benches are full of them. They stay here all night. We had better, perhaps, turn back." "Nonsense!" Lilian Rosenberg replied. "I'm not a bit afraid. There's another groan. I'm going to see what's up," and before he could stop her she had disappeared in the darkness. "Here I am," she called. "Come. It's some one ill." Plunging on in the darkness, Kelson at last found Lilian. She was sitting on a chair under a tree by the side of a man who was lying curled up on the ground. "He's had nothing to eat for 2 days, and has Bright's disease," Lilian Rosenberg announced. "Can't we do something for him?" "Two gentlemen told me just now," the man on the ground groaned, "that if I stayed here for a couple of hours, they would pass by again and guarantee to cure me. I reckoned there was no cure for Bright's disease when it is chronic, like it is in my case, but they laughed and said, 'We can, or at least shall be able to cure anything.'" "What were the two gentlemen like?" Kelson asked. "How could I tell?" the man moaned. "I couldn't see their faces any more than I can see yours, but they talked like you, twang, 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 all through their noses." "Sounds as if it might be Hamar and Curtis," Kelson remarked. "That's it," the man ejaculated. "Hamar. I heard the other fellow call him by that name." "How long ago is it since they were here?" "I can't say. Perhaps 10 minutes. I've lost count of time and everything else since I've slept out here. They talked of going up to the Serpentine." "We had better try and find them," Kelson said. "If you had the money, couldn't you get shelter for the night?" Lilian Rosenberg said. "It must be awful to lie out here in the cold, feeling ill and hungry." "I daresay some place would take me in," the man muttered, "only I couldn't walk at least no distance." "Well, here's 5 shillings," Lilian Rosenberg said. "Put it somewhere safe and try to hobble to the gates. If they haven't closed them, you will be all right." "5 shillings!" the man gasped. It's no good. I can't count. I've no head now. Thank you, missy. God bless you. I'll get something hot, something to stifle the pain." He struggled on to his knees, and Lilian Rosenberg helped him to rise. "How could you be so foolish as to touch him?" Kelson said, as they started off down a path they hoped would take them to the Serpentine. "You may depend upon it, he was swarming with vermin. Tramps always are." "Very probably, but I run just as much risk in a bus, the twopenny tube, or a cinematograph show. Besides, I can't see a human being helpless without offering help. Listen, there's someone else groaning. The park is full of groans." What she said was true. The park was full of groans. From every direction, borne to them by the gently rustling wind, came the groans of countless suffering outcasts, legions of homeless, starving men and women. Some lay right out in the open on their backs, others under cover of the trees, others again on the seats. They lay everywhere, those shattered, tattered, battered wrecks of humanity, those gangrened exiles from society, to whom no one ever spoke, whom no one ever looked at, whom no one ever would own that they had seen, whose lot in life not even a stray cat envied. Here were 2 of them, a man and a woman, tightly hugged in each other's embrace, not for love, but for warmth. Lilian Rosenberg almost fell over them, but they took no notice of her. Every now and then one of them would emerge from the shelter of the trees and cross the grass in the direction of the distant gleaming water, with silent, stealthy tread. Once a tall, gaunt figure suddenly sprang up and confronted the 2 adventurers. But the moment Kelson raised his stick, it jabbered something wholly unintelligible and sped away into the darkness. "A scene like this makes one doubt the existence of a good God," Lilian Rosenberg said. "It makes one doubt the existence of anything but hell," Kelson said. "Compared with all this suffering, the suffering of these thousands of hungry, hopeless wretches, the bulk of whom are doubtless tortured incessantly with the pains of cancer and tuberculosis, to say nothing of neuralgia and rheumatism, Dante's Inferno and Virgil's Hades, pale into insignificance. The devil is kind compared with God." "I believe you are right," Lilian Rosenberg said. "I never thought the devil was half as bad as he was painted."
The Park to night gives the lie direct to the ethics of all religions, and to the boasted efforts of all governments, churches, chapels, hospitals, police, progress and civilization. There is no misery, I am sure, to vie with it in any pagan land, either now or at any other period in the world's history." "True," Kelson replied. "And why is it? It is because civilization has killed charity. Giving, in its true sense, if it exists at all, is rarely to be met with. Giving in exchange, that is, in order to gain, flourishes everywhere. People will subscribe for the erection of monuments to kings and statesmen, or to well known and often richly endowed charitable institutes, in exchange for the pleasure of seeing in the newspapers a list of the subscribers' names, and themselves included amongst those whom they consider a peg above them socially, or in exchange for votes or notoriety, they will give liberally to the brutal strikers or outings for poor." "I suppose by the poor you mean the pampered, ill-mannered and detestably conceited County Council children," Lilian Rosenberg chimed in. "I wouldn't give a farthing to such a miscalled charity, no, not if I were rolling in riches." "And I think you would be right," Kelson replied, "but for these really poor Park refugees it is a different matter. Obviously no one will make the slightest effort to work up the public interest on their behalf, simply because they are labelled useless. They belong nowhere, they have no votes, they are too feeble to combine, they are even too feeble to commit an atrocious murder. Consequently, for the help they would receive, they could give nothing in return. By the by, I doubt if they could muster between them a pair of suspenders, a bootlace, a shirt button, or even a—" Lilian Rosenberg caught him by the arm. "Stop," she said. "That's enough. Don't get too graphic. What's the matter with that tree?" They were now close beside the banks of the Serpentine. The moon had broken through its covering of black clouds, and they perceived, some 20 yards ahead of them, a tall, isolated lime that was rocking in a most peculiar manner. Chapter 26. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 27 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 27. The Right Girl to Marry. Though the wind was nothing more than the usual night breeze of early autumn, the lime tree was swaying violently to and fro, as if under the influence of a stupendous hurricane. Lilian Rosenberg and Kelson were so fascinated that they stood and watched it in silence. At last it left off swaying and became absolutely motionless. They then noticed, for the first time, that there were 3 figures standing under its branches, and that one of the figures was a policeman. "Hide quickly," Kelson whispered. "Those other 2 are Hamar and Curtis. Quick, for God's sake, or they will see you." Lilian Rosenberg hid behind an elm. "Hullo!" Kelson called out, advancing to the group.
"Why, it's you, Matt!" Curtis cried. "Hamar said you would come."
"Said I would come? How the deuce did he know?" Kelson exclaimed. "I didn't know myself till the moment before I started."
"I willed you," Hamar explained. "As soon as I got back to my rooms after the show, a voice said in my ears, I heard it distinctly, 'Be at the Serpentine, the south bank, underneath a lime tree. You will know which, at 12 to night.' I looked round. There was no one there. Naturally, concluding this was a message from the Unknown, I hastened off to Curtis, who was in his digs, and needless to say, eating, and having dragged him away with me in a diabolical temper, I then sought you. Where were you?"
"Taking a walk. I felt I needed it."
"Alone? You are sure you weren't out with some girl?"
"I swear it. It seems as if I'm not the only liar," Lilian Rosenberg said to herself in her place of concealment. "What would Shield say to that?"
"Huh! I don't know if I ought to believe you," Hamar remarked. "Did you feel me willing you to come here?"
"Rather," Kelson said. "That is why I came. I seemed to hear your voice say, 'To Hyde Park, to Hyde Park, the Serpentine, the Serpentine.'" Then, sinking his voice, he whispered, "What's up with the policeman? He looks deuced queer."
"He's in a trance. We found him like this," Hamar said. "He is undoubtedly under the control of the Unknown. I expect it to speak through him every moment. Get ready to take down all he says. I've come prepared," and he handed Kelson and Curtis each a pencil and a reporter's notebook. He had hardly done so when the policeman, a burly man well over 6 feet in height, who was standing bolt upright as if at attention, his limbs absolutely rigid, his eyes wide open and expressionless, began to speak in a soft, lisping voice that the trio at once identified with the voice of the Unknown, the voice of the tree on that eventful night in San Francisco. "The great secret of medicine, the secret of healing will now be revealed to you," the voice said. "Pay heed. In cases of tumors and ulcers, take a young syringa, lay it for half an hour over the stomach of the afflicted person. Then plant it with the mumia, that is, either the hair, blood, or spittle of the sick person at midnight. As soon as the syringa begins to rot, the ulcer will heal. In phthisis pulmonalis, the mumia of the sick person should be planted with a cutting of the catalpa. After the latter has been subjected for some minutes to the breath of the diseased person. As soon as the cutting shows signs of decay, the sick person will be cured. In diabetes, plant the mumia of the patient with a bignonia, and as soon as the latter begins to rot, the diabetes will go. In appendicitis, cover the stomach of the sick person with a piece of raw beef until the sweat enters it. Then give the meat to a cat, and as soon as the latter has eaten it, the patient will recover." "What becomes of the cat?" Kelson asked. "The appendicitis is transferred to it," the voice explained. "It should be killed at once. In cancer, take the sea wrack torek mendrek, a weed of deep mauve color streaked with white. It must be boiled for 3 hours in clear spring water. 3 ounces of wrack to half a pint of water, and then let to cool. When quite cool, the dessertspoon of it should be taken by the sufferer every 4 hours, and at the end of 2 days the disease will have completely disappeared. The wrack is to be found at the 20-fathom level, 6 miles west-southwest of the Scilly Isles. In Bright's disease, the mumia of the afflicted should be planted at 1 a.m. with a cutting of sassafras, after the latter has been slept on for 1 whole night by the sufferer. As soon as the sassafras begins to rot, the patient will be cured. In dropsy, place a hair that has been strangled over the diseased portion of the body, and let it remain there for 1 hour. Then bury the hair, together with the mumia of the sick person, and as soon as the hair begins to decay, the patient will recover. In jaundice and liver diseases, apart from sarcoma, plant the mumia of the afflicted at 2 a.m. with a cutting of black walnut, and as soon as the latter begins to decay, the sufferer will get well. In all skin diseases, the mumia of the patient must be planted at midnight with a cutting of hickory, and when the latter begins to rot, the disease disappears.
In all fevers the mumia must be planted at 3 a.m. with laurel cuttings, after the latter have been placed under the bed of the patient for one night. As soon as the cuttings show signs of rotting, the fever abates. In acute inflammations, diseases of the heart, rheumatism and lumbago, the mumia must be buried at midnight with a raven that has been drowned, and placed on a chair left by the side of the patient for one night. As soon as the raven begins to rot, the patient will be fully restored to health. In cases of insanity, hysteria, and nervous diseases, the mumia of the sufferer must be planted, at 2 a.m., with a cutting of white poplar, and as soon as the latter shows evidences of decay, the afflicted will get well. In cases of hypochondria and melancholia, the mumia of the sufferer must be planted, at 4 a.m., with a crocus, and as soon as the latter begins to rot, the disease will depart. In every case it will be necessary to prelude the performance with the following invocation: O most powerful and prescient Unknown, before whom the greatest of the Atlanteans prostrate themselves, that was in the beginning, that is now, and always will be, I conjure thee by the magic symbols of the club foot, the hand with the fingers clenched, and the bat, in this magical year of Kefana, to extend to me thy wonderful powers of healing. Rena Vadula Hipsano Ike Deu Barinas. The lisping voice ceased, and with a convulsive start the policeman came to himself. "Hullo!" he said, in his natural gruff tones, rubbing his eyes. "I must have dropped off. Who are you? What are you doing in the park at this time of night?" "We've been watching you," Hamar said. "It is a bit of a phenomenon to see a London bobby asleep on his beat." "And to hear him talking in his sleep, too," Curtis added. "I didn't know I was talking," the policeman muttered. "It all comes of being too many hours on duty. What have you got those notebooks out for? Not been taking down anything about me, have you?" "Show us out of the park, and you'll hear no more about it," Hamar said. "And we'll give you half a sovereign into the bargain," Kelson chimed in. "Follow me, then," the policeman said. "I'll take you to one of the side entrances." "Matt!" Hamar exclaimed, as they passed the tree beyond which Lilian Rosenberg was hiding. "I smell scent, and what is more, I recognize it. It is Violette de Mer, the scent that Rosenberg uses. You were with her this evening." "I swear I wasn't," Kelson replied. "I bought some scent in Regent Street this afternoon." Hamar grunted. "I have my doubts." They walked on in silence till they came to a small iron gate, where the policeman left them, whilst he went to the lodge for the keys, and all the while Kelson was in terror lest Hamar should catch sight of Lilian Rosenberg, who had kept close behind them and was now standing but a few yards away, trying to conceal her identity and escape notice. But the policeman, on his return with the keys, called out to her, and Kelson, fearing that she might either be taken in charge for loitering there, in apparent suspicious circumstances, or made to remain in the park all night, neither of which contingencies he could possibly permit, at once came forward and explained that she was a friend of his. The policeman was satisfied. The sight of another half sovereign had rendered him more than polite, and without saying a word he let them all out together. The moment they were in the street, Hamar turned on Kelson, white with passion. "So," he said, "I was right after all. Liar! Fool! You would risk all our lives for a few hours' flirtation with this silly girl."
"If it's only flirtation, Leon, what does it matter?" Curtis interposed. "For goodness sake, shut up wrangling and let's get home. I'm starving."
"I shall have something to say to you to morrow morning," Hamar remarked in an undertone to Lilian Rosenberg. "And I to you," was the furious reply. I shall not forget the disrespectful way in which you have just spoken of me in alluding to the scent." She signalled to a taxi, and giving Kelson a friendly good night, jumped into it and was speedily whirled away. On the whole, the evening had been a disappointment. She had wanted to see the unknown, the awful thing that inspired Kelson and his colleagues with such unmitigated horror, and instead she had seen only an obsessed policeman, a cataleptic copper, who, had he not spoken in a strangely uncanny voice, would certainly have seemed to her absolutely ordinary. With regard to Hamar's displeasure, she was not in the slightest degree disturbed. He would never dare say anything to her, and after all that had occurred, he would never venture to sack her. All the same, she hated him. There was just sufficient in her conduct to make the name he had called her by applicable. Therefore, her bitterest wrath and indignation were roused against him. He had behaved unpardonably. She could kill him for it.
"I'll just show him," she said to herself, "what that uncivil tongue of his can do. He shall see that it can do him infinitely more harm than all Kelson's love making. For one thing, I'll spoil his chances with Gladys Martin, and I wonder if I could make use of what I know about him as a means of getting friendly again with Shiel. At all events, I'll try."
With this object in view, she went round to Shiel's lodgings, and was informed by the landlady that Shiel was ill.
"Nothing serious, I hope?" she asked.
"It has been," the landlady replied, "but he is better now. It all came through his not taking proper care of himself."
"May I see him, do you think?" Lilian Rosenberg inquired.
"I don't know," the landlady grumbled. "He's in a very touchy mood. No one can do nothing right for him. But maybe there won't be any harm in you trying," she added, her eyes wandering to the half crown in Lilian Rosenberg's fingers. She opened the door somewhat wider, and Lilian Rosenberg entered. Shiel was immensely surprised to see her. Illness and solitude had very considerably subdued him, and though at first he showed some resentment, he speedily softened under her sympathetic solicitation for his health. She put his room straight and dusted the furniture, got tea for him, and when she had completely won him over by these kindly actions, and made him beg her pardon for ever having spoken harshly to her, she broached the subject all the while uppermost in her mind, the subject of Hamar and Gladys.
"He hasn't the slightest intention of marrying her," she said. "All he wants is to make her his mistress, so as to be able to throw her over the moment he gets tired of her, and then marry some one of title. He is tremendously taken with her, of course. Her physical beauty, which he had the impudence to tell me surpassed that of any other woman he had seen, appeals strongly to his grossly sensual nature. If she won't give in to him now, she will be obliged to do so in 6 months' time."
"I don't understand you," Shiel said feebly. "Why in 6 months' time?" Lilian Rosenberg then told him what she knew about the compact.
"So you see," she added, "that if the final stage is reached, no woman will be safe. The trio will have any girl they fancy entirely at their mercy."
"How inconceivably awful!" Shiel exclaimed. "Surely there is some way of stopping them."
"There is only one way," Lilian said slowly. "The union between the three must be broken. They must quarrel and dissolve partnership."
"You may be sure they will take good care not to do that."
"Don't be too sure," Lilian Rosenberg replied. "Matthew Kelson is very fond of me. With a little persuasion he would do anything I asked."
"Then do you think you could bring about a rupture between him and Hamar?" Shiel asked eagerly.
"I might."
"And you will. You will save Gladys Martin after all." Lilian did not reply at once.
"Do you think she is the sort of girl who would marry poverty?" she said evasively. "Poverty like this?" and she glanced round the room.
"I won't ask her to," Shiel exclaimed. "Whilst I have been lying in bed ill, I have thought of many things, and have come to the conclusion I have no right ever to think of marrying. It is difficult for me to earn enough to keep one person in comfort, and I've lost all hope of ever earning enough to keep two."
"Well, if you don't ask her," Lilian Rosenberg said, "there's one thing, she will never ask you. And I think you are remarkably well out of it. If you do ever marry, marry a girl that has grit, a girl that can be a real pal to you, a girl that would help you to win fame."
End of chapter 27. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 28 of the Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 28. Whom will he marry? Had Lilian Rosenberg been able to see the effect of her conversation upon Shiel after she had left him, she would have been disappointed. He had, prior to his interview with Lilian Rosenberg, as he told her, made up his mind to abandon all idea of marrying Gladys Martin, and there is a possibility that had her name not been mentioned, had she not been recalled so vividly to his mind, he would have adhered to that resolution, at all events so long as he refrained from seeing her. But such is human nature, or at least man's nature, that directly Lilian Rosenberg had left him, Shiel's love for Gladys burst out with such wild, invigorated force that it swept reason and everything else before it. Gladys! He could think of nothing else. Every detail in her appearance, every word she had spoken, came back to him with exaggerated intensity. Her beauty was sublime. There was no one like her, no one that could inspire him with such a sense of ideality. No one that could lead him on to such dizzy heights of greatness. It was all nonsense to say, as Lilian Rosenberg had said, there were just as many good fish in the sea as had ever come out of it. There was only one Gladys. Hamar should never marry her. He would marry her himself. She must be told at once of Hamar's infamous designs. A mad desire to see her came over him, and disregardful of the doctor's orders that he should remain in bed several more days, he got up, and dressing as fast as his weak condition would allow him, took a taxi and drove to Waterloo. On reaching the cottage at Kew, he found Gladys at home, and to his great joy, alone. There is nothing that appeals to a woman more than a sick man, and Shiel, in coming to Gladys in his present condition, had unwittingly played a trump card. Had he appeared well and strong, she would probably have received him none too cordially, for she was very tired of men just then. But the moment her eyes alighted on his thin cheeks, and she saw the dark rings under his eyes, pity conquered. This man, at least, was not to blame. He was not of the same pattern as other men. He was not like so many men whose adulations had grown fulsome to her, and he was totally unlike Hamar. In very sympathetic tones she inquired how he was, and on learning that he had been sufficiently ill to be kept in bed, asked why he had not told her.
"Auntie and I would have called to see you," she said, "and brought you jelly and other nice things. Who waited on you? Had you no nurse?"
Fearful lest he should give her the impression he was speaking for effect, or trying to trade on her feelings Shiel was one of those people who are painfully exact he told her as simply as he could just how he had been placed.
"But why come here?" Gladys demanded, "when you were told to stay in bed till the end of the week? It is frightfully risky."
Shiel then explained to her the purport of his visit.
"Then it was to warn me, to put me on my guard against Hamar, that you disobeyed the doctor's orders," she said.
Shiel nodded. "You are not displeased, are you?" he asked nervously.
"I am displeased with you for thinking so little of yourself," Gladys said, "and more than obliged to you for thinking so much of me. You know I only consented to marry Mr. Hamar to save my father, and you say he no longer has the power to work spells?"
"I believe that to be a fact," Shiel replied.
"Then he lied to me," Gladys observed. "He threatened that unless I saw him as often as he wished, and went with him wherever he wanted, and a good many more things, he would inflict my father with every conceivable disease. You are quite sure your information is correct?"
"Absolutely."
"Then thank God," Gladys said with a great sigh of relief. "I shall know how to act now."
"You will break off your engagement?" Shiel inquired eagerly.
"No, I can't do that," Gladys said sadly. "I promised to marry Mr. Hamar, and therefore marry him I must."
"Promises made under such conditions are extortions. They don't count."
"I fear they do," Gladys replied. "I've never yet broken my word."
"Then there's no hope for me," Shiel gasped. "I must go. It maddens me to see you the affianced bride of that devil." He rose to go, but had hardly gained his feet when his strength utterly failed and he collapsed. Gladys helped him into a chair, and then flew for some brandy. In the hall she met her aunt, who had just returned from an afternoon call. In a few words she explained what had happened.
"Poor young man," Miss Templeton said. "I thought he looked very ill the last time I saw him. And he came here solely to benefit you. Well, you have a good deal to answer for, and your face is not only your own misfortune, but other people's too. But it will never do for your father to see Mr. Davenport. He went off in a very bad temper this morning, and if he comes back and finds him here, there'll be a scene."
Miss Templeton and Gladys consulted together for some minutes, and then decided to send for a taxi and have Shiel conveyed back to his rooms, Miss Templeton accompanying him. Miss Templeton knew that Shiel was poor, but like most people who have lived in comfortable surroundings all their lives, she had no idea of what poverty was like. The poverty of a 7 and 6 week room in a back street, and when she saw it she nearly swooned.
"Why, this is a slum!"
she ejaculated as the taxi stopped next door to a fried fish shop in a narrow street swarming with children, sucking bread and jam and rolling each other over in the gutters.
"I don't wonder the man is ill here," she said to herself as the door of the house they stopped at opened and she snuffed the atmosphere. "The place reeks, and, oh gracious, is this the landlady?"
Yet the woman was ordinary enough, the type of landlady one sees in all back streets. Greasy face, straggling hair, dirty blouse, black hands, bitten fingernails, short skirts, prodigious feet, a grubby child clinging onto her dress, and every indication of the speedy arrival of another.
"I suppose you're his mother, hain't you, mum?" she said, gaping at Miss Templeton's rather fashionable clothes in open mouthed wonder. "I told him he ought not to go out, but he never heeds what I says."
Miss Templeton, though not particularly flattered at being taken for Shiel's mother, since, like most ladies of mature age, she wished to be regarded as much younger, nevertheless thought it better not to disillusion the woman. The poor, she told herself, often have very decided views on propriety. With the woman's aid she got Shiel upstairs, and as he was too feeble to undress himself, despite his protestations, helped to disrobe him. She had thought, when she first saw the slum, of returning to Kew at once, but she did no such thing. She stayed with Shiel, persuaded the landlady to make him some gruel, which proved to be a sorry mess, but had at least the advantage of being hot, and bribed one of the children to fetch the doctor. Shiel nearly died. Had it not been for the careful nursing and good food provided by Miss Templeton, who visited him every day, he would never have turned the corner.
"The poor dear is terribly fond of you," Miss Templeton said to Gladys. "In his delirium he talked of nothing but saving you from Leon Hamar, from that devil Leon Hamar. And if one can place any reliance at all on the cravings of a sick man, a devil, Leon Hamar undoubtedly is. What a pity it is Shiel hasn't money."
These remarks were naturally not without effect on Gladys, and she could not help growing more and more interested in the man, whose love for her had proved so deep-rooted an ideal that he practically sacrificed his life in an attempt to save her. Finally, she found herself awaiting her aunt's daily report of his illness with an anxiety that was almost acute. In the meantime, John Martin came home one evening in a rare state of excitement.
"What do you think?" he exclaimed, throwing a bundle of letters on the table. "One of Dick's speculations has turned out trumps after all. He had invested several thousands of pounds in Shiel's name in enamel ivorine, the new stuff for stopping teeth, which looks exactly like part of the teeth. I remember I thought it an absurd adventure at the time, but for once in a way I was wrong."
Interrupted Gladys.
"There has been a sudden boom in the patent. Every dentist is using it, and as a consequence the shares have risen enormously. I've heard from Dick's lawyer to day that Shiel is now worth £50,000.
"Good heavens!" Miss Templeton ejaculated. "And Gladys has bound herself to Hamar. I suppose," she said afterwards, when John Martin and she were together alone, "that you would not have any objection to Shiel now if Gladys were free to marry him?"
"Certainly not," John Martin said. "Certainly not. I always liked Shiel, a fine manly young fellow, very different to the type one usually meets nowadays. I only wish Gladys were free." "You would raise no obstacle to her becoming engaged to Shiel?" "None whatsoever. But what's the good of talking about an impossibility? Gladys is stubbornness herself, and once she has made up her mind to do a thing, nothing in God's world will make her not do it." "Wait," Miss Templeton said. "Wait and see. I think I can see a possible way out of it." She had learned much from Shiel in his wanderings. He had constantly alluded to Hamar, Curtis, Kelson and Lilian Rosenberg, to the Great Compact and to the one possible way of breaking that compact, namely, through the instigation of a quarrel between the trio. From several of the statements he had made, Miss Templeton deduced that Kelson was greatly under the influence of Lilian Rosenberg, and it was from these statements that she finally received an inspiration. Miss Templeton saw deeper than Shiel. It had always been her custom to read between the lines. "Now," she argued, "if Kelson were so easily influenced by Lilian Rosenberg, who is young and attractive, it was almost a sine qua non that he was in love with her." And as marriage was one of the eventualities strictly forbidden to the trio in the compact, "They must neither quarrel nor marry," Shiel had exclaimed. Here was their chance. Kelson must marry Lilian Rosenberg, and by so doing break the compact and overwhelm the trio in some sudden and dire catastrophe. But the marriage must take place within 6 months' time. How could that be arranged? Could Lilian Rosenberg be bribed or persuaded into it? For, of course, Miss Templeton, being a woman, albeit an old maid, had at once divined that Lilian Rosenberg was in love with Shiel, that she did not care a straw for Kelson, and that to marry the latter she would need some very strong inducement. And the only inducement she could think of was Lilian's genuine love for Shiel. "Yes, it is upon this one weakness of Lilian's that I must work," she said to herself. "It is the only way I can see of saving Gladys." Resolved at any rate to experiment upon these lines, she lost no time in seeking out Lilian Rosenberg, who received her very coldly and was distinctly rude. "What have my affairs to do with you? Who sent you here?" she demanded. "Humanity," Miss Templeton replied. "I have come entirely of my own accord to plead the cause of one who is seriously ill, possibly dying." "Seriously ill? Possibly dying?" Lilian Rosenberg said incredulously, nevertheless turning pale. "Mr. Davenport is surely not as bad as all that." "When did you see him last?" Miss Templeton asked. "A fortnight ago," Lilian Rosenberg replied. "I have been inundated with work these past 2 weeks." "Then you've not heard that he's had a relapse," Miss Templeton said, "and is now in a most critical condition. He has something on his mind, and the doctor assures me that whilst he is still worrying over that something, there is no chance of recovery." "Do you know what it is, the something?" Lilian Rosenberg asked, the white on her cheeks intensifying. "Yes," Miss Templeton said slowly, and trying to appear calm. "He is very worried about Miss Martin's engagement to Mr. Hamar." "And why, pray?" "Because he knows all about Mr. Hamar and the compact." "He has told you?" "I have gleaned it from what he has said in his delirium." "Has he been as ill as that?" "Yes, he has. He had a temperature of 104 the day before yesterday." For a few moments there was silence. Then Lilian Rosenberg said, "Can you believe what a man says in delirium?" "In this instance I feel sure you can," Miss Templeton replied. "Why should Miss Martin's engagement be of such interest to Mr. Davenport?" Miss Templeton thought for a moment. "Because," she said at last, "he is in love with her." "Are you sure of it?" "Absolutely." "Do you think she cares for him even as much as that?" And she snapped her fingers. "I think she may care for him a very great deal some day. She has begun to care for him already." "But she never would dream of marrying one. As badly off as Mr. Davenport, he is practically starving." "He was, but he's not now. He's come into money,"
and she explained about the £50,000. "I see," Lilian Rosenberg said, after a prolonged pause. "That accounts for her having just begun to care for him. Supposing there was some one who had been fond of him all along, in the days when he hadn't a halfpenny to his name, and every one else shunned him." "I should feel very sorry for that person," Miss Templeton said, "but setting aside the sacrifice of his happiness, it would be wrong for him to marry her if his heart was fixed elsewhere." "Which you say it is." "Which I am sure it is." "Well, supposing it is, what does it concern me? Why tell me all this?" "Because it lies in your power to put an end to the compact and bring about the catastrophe the Unknown threatened." "I think you credit me with rather too much. I do not quite see how I can accomplish all this." "But I do," Miss Templeton said briskly. "I believe I am right in saying Mr. Kelson is in love with you, that you can make him do pretty well anything you please. Well, all you have to do is lead him on to propose and insist on his marrying you at once, or at all events before the expiration of the compact. If you succeed in doing this, the compact will be broken." "That may be," Lilian Rosenberg exclaimed, "but where, pray, should I come in? Why on earth should I marry a man I don't care a snap for?" "Why," Miss Templeton replied slowly, "why, because marrying a man you don't care a snap for, you would save the life of a man I am quite sure you care a very great deal for." End of Chapter 28. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California. Chapter 29 of The Sorcery Club by Elliott O'Donnell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Chapter 29 The End and the Beyond. It took Lilian Rosenberg some time to make up her mind. "It's extraordinary," she said to herself, "how fond I am of Shiel. I used to think it an impossibility for me to be really fond of anyone. The question is, however, am I sufficiently in love with him to give him up to that soft little cat, Gladys Martin? If it weren't for this illness, if I could only persuade myself that he wasn't as ill as Miss Whatever her name is said, I shouldn't think twice. I should let things be. But as I feel surely he is really ill, dangerously ill, and the only chance of his recovery lies in the possibility of his marrying Martin, I must deliberate. Shall I or shall I not? If it were any other woman I shouldn't so much mind, but Gladys Martin, I can't endure her. There is one hope, however, namely, that if he marries her he will soon tire of her and come to me. What a tremendous score off her that would be. But no, I wouldn't do that, because, well, there, just like my infernal luck, I love him. Could I marry him, I wonder, even if there were no Gladys Martin? It is doubtful. Yet I believe I could. But what is the good of conceiving impossibilities? There is a Gladys Martin, and I can never have Shiel. The only question I have to settle is, shall she have him? Shall I marry Kelson so that Martin can marry Shiel? Lilian Rosenberg turned this question over in her mind for a whole day and night, sometimes arriving at one decision, sometimes at another. In the end, very elaborately dressed and looking daintier than she had ever done in her life, she waylaid Kelson and asked him to have tea with her. Any pretty face, accentuated by all the allurements of a large mushroom hat and hobble skirt, was enough for Kelson. But when that face belonged to the one girl for whom, above all other girls, he had a colossal weakness, he simply could not feast his eyes enough on it. "Have tea with you? Of course I will," he said. "But we must be careful. Hamar is about. If you walk on up the Haymarket, I'll follow in a taxi and pick you up directly I get to a safe distance." "I see you are as much in awe of Mr. Hamar as ever," Lilian Rosenberg laughed. "I'm not. I've found him out. He's all talk. But do as you will, get your taxi and I'll walk on. We'll have tea in my new flat." Kelson was so delighted he hardly knew if he stood on his head or his heels. "You are prettier than ever," he said as the taxi door shut and they sped away. "I declare there seems to be no limit to your beauty." "Only because you're partial," she said. "I shall grow ugly one day perhaps soon." With a savage energy she set to work to completely overcome him. With a languishing expression in her eyes which she made use of mercilessly, without giving him a moment's respite, he watched his whole being vibrate with love and adoration. They had hardly entered the drawing room of her flat when he threw himself at her feet, and poured forth his worship of her in the most extravagant phrases. "Look here, Mr. Kelson," she said at length, withdrawing the hand it seemed as if he would never leave off kissing. "This is all very well, but I daresay you make love to countless other girls in the same fashion. How can I tell if you are really serious?" "Don't I look as if I am?" he cried. "One can never judge correctly by looks," she replied. "They are terribly deceptive. You are very emphatic in your avowals of love, but you say nothing about marriage." "Then you do care for me. Jerusalem! How happy I should be if only I thought that." "Think it then," Lilian Rosenberg said, "and let us come to an understanding. Can you afford to keep a wife, keep her as I should expect to be kept? Plenty of new dresses, jewellery, theatres, balls, motors, Ascot, Henley, cows?" "I reckon I could do all that," Kelson replied. "I've just over £150,000 in the bank, and with this 'cure' business I'm taking on an average 10,000 per week. I would settle 100,000 on you and make you a handsome allowance. 1,000 a week more if you wanted it." "Well," Lilian Rosenberg said after a slight pause, during which Kelson had again seized her hand and was kissing it convulsively, "to quote one of your Americanisms, I reckon I'll fix up with you. On one condition, however." "And that?" Kelson murmured, still kissing her feverishly. "That we marry a week to day." Kelson dropped her hand as if he had been shot. "We can't," he replied. "The compact." "Oh, damn the compact," Lilian Rosenberg said coolly. "You marry me then or not at all." "You are joking. You know what the compact means." "I know what you think it means. For my own part, I don't see that you have the slightest reason to fear. The Unknown cannot really harm you. All you have to do is to turn religious. Anyhow, you must risk it. That is to say, if you want me." "It will lead to a quarrel with Hamar," Kelson said desperately. "The firm will dissolve, and I shan't get a cent more money." "I'll be content with what you have in the bank now. We can live on the interest of 50,000. The 100,000 you will, of course, settle on me at once." He was silent. She taunted him. She ridiculed him. She at last lost her temper with him, whereupon he succumbed. The marriage should take place at a registry office within the week. "There'll be no time for a trousseau," he said. "Oh, hang the trousseau," she said. "I shall have the £100,000. And now for a word of advice. Be sure that you do not let Hamar get any inkling of our approaching marriage, and be most careful to avoid doing anything that might arouse his suspicions. It isn't that I'm afraid of him, but I don't want rows. I'm sick to death of them." "You can rely on me to be careful, darling," Kelson said, kissing her on the lips. "I'll be discretion itself." And so he meant to be. All the same, as is the case with every lover worthy of the name lover, who loves with all the full ripe vigour of genuine passion, his heart played havoc with his head, and he was blind to everything save visions of his beloved. In other circumstances this would not have mattered very much, but with Hamar's lynx eyes continually watching him it was certain to lead to disaster. "Ed," Hamar said to Curtis one day, "Matt's been getting into mischief. I know the symptoms well. He can't look me in the face, and every now and then, when he fancies my attention is attracted elsewhere, I catch him peeping furtively at me as if he were frightened out of his life I should ferret out some secret. It would be deplorable if now that we have got so near the end of the compact we should be held up by some idiotic blunder, some nonsensical love affair of his. I wonder whether it's Rosenberg or some other girl. Will you find out?" "How can I?" Curtis growled. "I'm not his keeper."
"I know that," Hamar said. "Come, be reasonable. You want to be a Croesus, so that you can eat and drink your head off, don't you? Well, you will. You will be one of the 3 wealthiest men in the world. You will have the world at your feet, if only you stick to me for the next 7 months, till we have passed the 7th stage. If you don't, if either you or Matt deliberately quarrel with me, or marry, then, as I've dinned into your ears 1,000 times, the compact will be broken, and not only that, but some frightful catastrophe will wipe us off. Now will you do what I ask? Come, a dinner with me every night this week at the Piccadilly, champagne and no vegetables." "All right," Curtis said sulkily. "For the good of the cause I suppose I must, but I hate spying." 2 nights later, in a private room at the Piccadilly, after dinner, when the champagne and liqueurs had got into Curtis's head, and he was leaning back in his chair smiling and silly, Hamar suddenly said: "Ed, you remember what I told you about watching Kelson? Have you discovered anything?" "Supposing I have," Curtis replied. "Supposing I haven't. What's then?" "Ah, but I know you have," Hamar said, striving to hide his eagerness. "Come, tell me. Another liqueur. I'll square it with the Unknown. It won't hurt you." "Won't it?" Curtis gurgled. "Won't it? I'll tell you everything. No, nothings, I mean." But Hamar, when once he had smelt a rat, was not easily put off. He coaxed and eventually succeeded. "Leonche," Curtis said with a sudden burst of drunken confidence. "Leonche, it's worse than either you or I suspected. I caught them alone this morning in my office." "Them? Rosenberg and Matt?" "Yes, of course, silly. I told Matt I was going out. He thought I had, so into the room I come, quite unsuspected, unobserved. She was sitting on his knees, cuddling, and he was putting a ring on her finger. '4 days more, darling,' says he, 'and we are married.' Jerusalem! Damn the compact, and damn's Hamar. Hamar doesn't suspect, does he? Rosenberg says. 'Not a bit, not in the slightest,' old Matt replies. 'Why, it is I who am's brave now.' Then he kisses her, and fearing they would detect my presence, I slips quietly out." "Will you swear this is true?" Leon said, his voice trembling with excitement. "I'll swear it," Curtis answered. "But you look cross. What's the matter, Leon? God, what's the matter?" An hour later, as Kelson was rising from his chair in front of the fire to gaze, for the 100th time that evening, into the eyes of Lilian Rosenberg's portrait on the mantelshelf, the door of his room flew open, and in staggered Curtis, white, wet, and bloated. "Great heavens!" Kelson cried. "What the deuce have you been doing to yourself? You look a perfect devil." "I am one," Curtis groaned. "I am one, Matt. I've given your show away."
"My show away? Why, what the deuce do you mean?" In a string of broken sentences, Curtis explained what had happened.
"I'm damn sorry, Matt, old man," he pleaded. "It was the drink that did it. I didn't know what I was saying till it was too late, till I saw Leon's face, and that cleared my brain, brought me to myself. It was hellish. I remember the moment I mentioned the word marriage, he sprang up from his chair, and as he hurried out I heard him mutter, 'I'll go straight to her. Matt, old man, he meant mischief. I'm certain of it. Come with me to her flat. For God's sake, come!' And catching hold of Kelson, who leaned against the mantelshelf, dazed and stupefied, he dragged him into the street. To revert to Hamar, Curtis's information had transformed him. He was now another creature. Prior to his conversation with Curtis, he had suspected, at the most, that Kelson might be contemplating a secret engagement to Lilian Rosenberg. But a hasty marriage, a marriage in a few days' time, he had never dreamt that Kelson could be as mad as that. It was outrageous. It was abominable. It was sheer wholesale homicide. At all costs the marriage must be stopped. And mad with rage, Hamar dashed out of the hotel, and calling a taxi,
drove direct to Lilian Rosenberg's flat. He found her alone and with a strange expression in her eyes, an expression he had never noticed in them before. She was in the act of examining a magnificent diamond ring. "You're quite out of breath," she said coolly. "Didn't you come up by the lift?" "I've come to talk business," Hamar panted. "It's no use looking like that. I know your secret." "My secret?" Lilian Rosenberg replied, opening her eyes and simulating the greatest unconcern. "What secret? I don't understand."
"Oh, yes, you do," Hamar said. "You understand only too well, you deceitful minx. Had I only been smart, I should have given you the sack months ago. This marriage of yours with Kelson shall not come off."
"My marriage with Mr. Kelson?" Lilian Rosenberg said, turning a trifle pale. "I really don't know what you're talking about."
"You do!" Hamar shouted, his fury rising. "You do! You know all about it. You were seen sitting on his knee this morning, and all your conversation was overheard. I have found out everything, and I tell you, you shan't marry him."
"I shan't marry him," Lilian Rosenberg said with provoking coolness. "Whoever thinks I want to marry him?"
"He does. I do!" Hamar shouted, his voice rising to a scream. "You've hoodwinked me long enough. You hoodwink me no longer. You've encouraged him from the first, made eyes at him every time you've seen him, taken advantage of my absence to prowl about the passages to waylay him, had him round to your rooms and visited in his. You've no sense of shame or honour. You've broken your promises to me. You're a liar."
"Anything else, Mr. Hamar?" Lilian Rosenberg said, her eyes glittering. "When you've quite finished, perhaps you'll kindly go and leave me in peace."
"Go? Leave you in peace?" Hamar shouted. "Damn you! Curse your impertinence! Go? I'll not budge an inch till I wring from you an oath, a solemn binding oath that you'll break off your engagement to Kelson at once."
"Really, Mr. Hamar," Lilian Rosenberg said, "I cannot put up with quite so much noise. Will you go, or shall I ring for the porter to turn you out?" She moved in the direction of the bell as she spoke, but before she could touch it, Hamar had intercepted her.
"Stop this foolery," he said, catching hold of her wrist. "I'm in grim earnest. The lives of all three of us are at stake, jeopardized through you, through your infernal greed and selfishness. Do you hear?"
"Please let go my wrist," she said quietly.
"I won't," he shouted. "I'll squeeze, crush it, break it. Break you too, unless you swear to break off your marriage."
"I'll swear nothing," Lilian Rosenberg said faintly. "You're a brute. Let me go, or I'll cry for help."
She screamed, but before she could repeat the scream, Hamar had her by the throat, and then, blind with passion, and before he fully realized what he was about, he had shaken her to and fro like a terrier shakes a rat, and dashed her on the floor. For some minutes he stood rocking with passion, and then, his eyes falling on the inanimate form at his feet, he gave a great gasping cry and bent over it. "God in heaven!" he ejaculated. "She's dead! I've killed her!"
He was still bending over her, still feeling her lifeless pulse, still trying to resuscitate her, feebly wondering how he had killed her, feverishly debating the best course to pursue, when Curtis and Kelson burst in on him. At the sight of Lilian Rosenberg's lifeless body, both men started back.
"Great God, Hamar!" Curtis gasped. "What have you done to her?"
"Nothing," Hamar said, turning a ghastly face to them. I found her like this."
"Liar!" Kelson shouted, beside himself with fury.
"Liar! We heard her scream. Look at your hands. There's blood on them. You've killed her." Before Curtis could stop him, he sprang at Hamar, and the next moment both men were rolling on the floor. "Call for the police, Ed," Kelson gasped. "The police, or—" But before he could utter another syllable, walls, floor and ceiling shook with loud, devilish laughter. There was then silence. Enthralling, impressive, omnipotent silence. The electric light went out, and the room filled with luminous, striped figures. End of Chapter 29. End of The Sorcery Club, by Elliott O'Donnell. Read by Don W. Jenkins, Rancho San Diego, California.